Julia's alarm goes off before dawn, not because she enjoys early mornings, but because she values unhurried ones. At 5:30 a.m., the city outside her apartment is still quiet, the skyline dim and blue-grey. She wakes with a practiced calm, silences the alarm, and spends a few moments grounding herself, breathing, stretching, letting her mind orient before the demands of the day arrive. Discipline has become second nature to her, but so has intention. She knows that how she begins her morning often determines how the rest of the day unfolds. By 6 o'clock, Julia is moving through her morning routine with quiet efficiency. She brews strong coffee, glances at overnight emails on her phone without responding, and reviews the day's calendar in her head. There's a client call, a strategy meeting with partners, and a deposition scheduled for the afternoon. She eats a simple breakfast, usually something healthy but unfussy, and changes into workout clothes. Physical training is non-negotiable for her. It sharpens her focus and gives her a sense of control before she steps into a world where outcomes are never guaranteed. At the gym, she runs or lifts weights with earbuds in, often listening to a podcast about law, business, or sometimes nothing at all. This is one of the few times in her day when no one is asking anything of her. By the time she finishes, she feels alert, steady, and ready. Back at her apartment, she showers, gets dressed, and applies makeup with a light, confident hand. Her wardrobe is precise and polished, tailored suits, neutral tones, subtle jewelry. She dresses not to impress, but to command respect without having to ask for it. By 8 a.m., Julia is on her way to the office. The commute is familiar, almost meditative. She reviews case notes on her tablet, flags emails to answer later, and mentally rehearses arguments. When she arrives at the firm's glass and steel building, the atmosphere shifts. The pace quickens. The stakes rise. This is where she is fully in her element. Her mornings are often dominated by meetings. In conference rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows, she sits across from senior partners, opposing counsel, or high-profile clients. Julia speaks clearly and decisively, choosing her words with care. She has earned her reputation not by being the loudest voice in the room, but by being the most prepared. When she challenges an assumption or proposes a strategy, people listen. Her intelligence is precise, her confidence quiet but unmistakable. Between meetings, she retreats to her office to work. This is where the real hours disappear. She drafts motions, reviews contracts line by line, and annotates case law with meticulous attention. Her desk is orderly, her computer desktop uncluttered. She thrives in complexity, finding satisfaction in turning chaos into structure. Lunch, when it happens, is often eaten at her desk. Salad, coffee, and a few minutes of scrolling through messages from friends she hasn't had time to see lately.
The afternoon brings more intensity. Depositions, negotiations, or court appearances demand her full focus. When she's in a deposition, Julia is sharp and composed, asking questions that seem simple but are carefully designed to corner the truth. She listens as much as she speaks, watching for hesitation, inconsistency, or overconfidence. This is the part of her job that outsiders often romanticize, but for Julia, it's work, serious, consequential, and mentally exhausting. By early evening, the office begins to thin out, but Julia often stays. She uses the quieter hours to plan ahead, returning calls, mentoring junior associates, or refining arguments for future cases. She takes pride in being someone others can rely on, even when she's tired. Still, she knows her limits. Burnout is a real risk in her profession, and she has learned, sometimes the hard way, that longevity requires boundaries. She leaves the office around 7:30 or 8 p.m., the city now alive with noise and movement. Some nights, she meets a friend for dinner or attends a professional event. Other nights, she goes straight home. Tonight is one of those quieter evenings. She stops by a small grocery store, picks up something simple for dinner, and heads back to her apartment. At home, Julia changes out of her suit and into something comfortable. She cooks while listening to music, the rhythm of it helping her shed the day's tension. Dinner is unhurried. She eats at the counter or on the couch, sometimes watching a show, sometimes just sitting in silence. This is when the armor comes off. The sharp attorney gives way to a woman who is thoughtful, reflective, and occasionally exhausted. Later, she might read, fiction or non-fiction, depending on her mood, or journal to process the day. She texts her family, checks in with a close friend, and makes a mental note to schedule something fun soon. Success has given her independence and security, but she is aware of what it can quietly take if she's not paying attention. By 10:30, Julia begins her nighttime routine. She prepares for the next day, setting out clothes, reviewing the morning schedule, then turns off the lights. As she gets into bed, her mind briefly revisits unfinished tasks or upcoming challenges, but she gently redirects herself. Tomorrow will come soon enough. When she falls asleep, it's with the steady satisfaction of someone who knows she has earned her rest. Julia's days are demanding, structured, and full, but they are also hers, shaped by ambition, discipline, and a deep understanding of who she is and what she's capable of becoming. Julia prided herself on control. Control of her arguments, her calendar, her tone, her cases. For months now, the embezzlement trial had bent itself around her will. Late nights, endless discovery disputes, strategy sessions that ran on caffeine and sheer force of intellect. She had built the case brick by brick, and at its center stood one indispensable pillar, the star witness, the insider, the one who could tie everything together. So when her phone rang late that morning and she saw the name on the screen, she answered with practiced calm. "Julia," she said. The voice on the other end wavered almost immediately. Polite, hesitant, apologetic in that way that set her nerves on edge before the words even landed. "I've been thinking," the witness began, "about the trial, about testifying, and I'm not sure I can go through with it." For a split second, Julia said nothing. Her eyes drifted to the city skyline outside her office window, as if the buildings might rearrange themselves into a solution. Inside, frustration flared hot and fast, but she kept her voice even. "Not sure how?" she asked. "You're under subpoena. We've prepared for this for months." "I know," the witness replied, "but the pressure is getting to me. My family's worried. The defense has been aggressive. I just need time to think." Time. The one thing this case did not have. Julia closed her eyes briefly, fingers tightening around the phone. She outlined the legal realities, the protections in place, the consequences of backing out. She did not yell. She did not plead. She argued, because that was what she did best. Still, when the call ended with nothing resolved beyond a vague promise to consider options, the silence in her office felt louder than any shouting match. She lowered the phone slowly onto her desk. The door to her office cracked open a moment later. Her associate, Mark, leaned in, legal pad in hand, clearly having sensed the tension. "Julia, I heard." She snapped her head toward him, the control she'd been gripping finally slipping. "Get the hell out of my office and shut the door." Mark froze, startled, then nodded once and retreated immediately. The door closed with a decisive thud. Julia exhaled sharply, pressing her palms flat against her desk. She hated moments like this, moments when the machinery faltered despite her precision. But fury, she knew, was useless unless it was put to work. She picked up the phone again. This time, when the witness answered, her tone was different. Still firm, but measured, strategic. "I want to come by your office later this afternoon," she said. "We need to talk face to face. No lawyers, no intermediaries. Just us."
There was a pause on the line, then a reluctant agreement. "All right," the witness said. "This afternoon." Julia hung up, already mentally rearranging the rest of her day. There would be no easy fixes, no guarantees, but there was still a chance to salvage what mattered. She grabbed her coat, squared her shoulders, and headed out. The elevator ride down felt interminable. As she stepped into the lobby of the building, the hum of conversation and footsteps washed over her, rounding her in the ordinary world that continued regardless of her internal crisis. The car service was scheduled to pick her up, another meeting, another obligation she couldn't afford to miss. She scanned the curb. The familiar black sedan wasn't there. Instead, a slightly newer model pulled up, and a man stepped out quickly, smoothing his jacket as he approached her. "Julia?" he asked, offering a polite smile. "I'm Brian. I'll be your driver today." Julia paused, appraising him. He looked young, too young perhaps to be driving clients like her, but professional enough. There was an earnestness in his expression that suggested nerves. "I'd just started with the company," Brian continued, opening the door for her. "I've heard great things about you, and I'm really looking forward to working with you." The words landed at the wrong moment. Compliments, enthusiasm. Normally, she might have acknowledged them with a nod or a brief thanks. Today, they slid right off her. Julia stepped into the car without ceremony. "Get me to where I need to be as quickly as possible," she said, her voice cold but unwavering. Brian blinked, then nodded, closing the door gently. "Of course, ma'am." As the car pulled away from the curb, Julia leaned back against the seat, eyes fixed on the city passing by. Control, she reminded herself, was not about preventing chaos. It was about facing it head-on and bending it, once again, to her will. Brian eased the car into a narrow curbside space across the street from the Star Witness's office building, a modest structure that looked painfully ordinary for the weight it carried in Julia's life. He shifted into park and glanced at the rearview mirror. Julia was already reaching for the door handle, her phone in hand, jaw set. "I may be a while," she said flatly as she stepped out. "Wait outside." "Yes, ma'am," Brian replied instinctively as the door closed behind her. He watched her stride toward the entrance, fast, purposeful, like someone marching into battle rather than a meeting. Then she disappeared inside, and the street settled back into its midday rhythm. Brian adjusted the temperature, folded his hands loosely over the steering wheel and waited. Minutes stretched. Then more minutes. Brian checked the time once, then deliberately stopped. He had learned quickly, even in his short tenure, that watching the clock only made it louder. Instead, he observed the small details: pedestrians passing with coffee cups, a delivery truck double parking and earning a chorus of honks, clouds sliding lazily across the sky. Nearly 2 hours passed this way, the car idling, the city breathing around him. Inside the building, time moved very differently. Julia sat across from the witness in a cramped office that smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee. She had abandoned pretense early on. This was no longer a meeting. It was a plea. "You are not a footnote in this case," she said, leaning forward, hands clasped tightly together. "You are the case. Without your testimony, the narrative fractures. The jury won't see the pattern. They won't understand the intent." The witness avoided her eyes, fingers twisting together in their lap. "I understand that," they said quietly. "But you're not the one who has to live with the consequences after. I'm the one who has to look over my shoulder." Julia tried everything. Logic, reassurance, appeals to duty, appeals to conscience. She spoke about the victims, about accountability, about how rarely the system offered a real chance to expose the truth so cleanly. Her voice grew hoarse,
her arguments circling back on themselves as she searched for something, anything, that would land. Finally, the witness sighed, rubbing their temples. "I can't give you an answer today," they said. "I need the weekend. I need to think about it without pressure." The words hit Julia like a slow, dull blow. She knew better than to push further. Pressing now could fracture what little trust remained. "Fine," she said at last, standing and smoothing her jacket. "But understand this. I don't have the luxury of waiting. Every day matters." The witness nodded but said nothing. Julia left without another word.
When she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon light felt harsher than before. Her shoulders were tense, her thoughts knotted tightly with frustration and fatigue. Brian straightened when he saw her approaching and opened the door immediately. "Welcome back," he said, gently. Julia slid into the seat, staring straight ahead. Brian pulled away from the curb smoothly, sensing the shift in atmosphere. The silence stretched, thick but not hostile. Yet. After a few blocks, he cleared his throat softly. "Long meeting?" he ventured, careful with his tone. Julia exhaled sharply, but didn't respond. Brian hesitated, then tried again, aiming for neutral ground. "Just thought I'd ask, have you eaten today? There's a great pizza place 2 blocks from here. Quick service, really good slice. Might help take the edge off." The response came swift and cutting. "I wish I had the time," Julia said, her voice edged with disdain, "to think about trivial things like pizza." Ryan's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, but he kept his eyes on the road. "Some of us don't get to pause our lives for lunch," Julia continued. "Some of us are responsible for cases that actually matter. Your job, your one job, is to get me from point A to point B. That's it. Moving forward, I prefer you do exactly that and not try to be creative. It's unwarranted." The words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Brian felt them land, absorbed them without reaction. He nodded once, slowly. "I understand," he said, simply, and then he fell silent. The rest of the drive passed without a single word. No small talk, no questions, just the low hum of the engine and the rhythm of traffic lights changing from red to green. Julia stared out the window, replaying the meeting in her mind, the witness's uncertainty looping relentlessly. Her anger cooled into something heavier, disappointment perhaps, or fear. But she made no move to soften what she'd said. Ryan pulled up in front of her office building with the same smooth precision as before. He shifted into park, stepped out, and opened her door. Julia exited without acknowledgement, already dialing her phone, already moving on to the next problem. As she disappeared into the building, Ryan returned to the driver's seat and sat for a moment longer than necessary. He exhaled, steady and quiet, then put the car back into gear. The city swallowed him up again, indifferent as ever, while above it all, Julia prepared for another round, still chasing control, still racing against time, and still unaware of the small human costs accumulating quietly in her wake. Monday morning arrived with the kind of brittle clarity Julia usually associated with trial days. Sharp light through the windows, a calendar packed with consequence, and a mind already racing ahead of the clock. She was halfway through reviewing a stack of motions when her phone rang. One glance at the number made her pause. She answered immediately. "Julia?" the voice on the other end said, steadier than it had been on Friday. "I've made a decision." Her spine straightened, every other thought evaporating. "I'm in," the witness continued. "I reconsidered everything over the weekend. The risks, the reasons I came forward in the first place. I'll testify. I'm back on the case." For a moment, Julia said nothing at all. Relief surged so fast it felt almost disorienting, like stepping onto solid ground after weeks at sea. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That's a wise decision," she said, her voice warm, reassuring, carefully free of any hint of triumph. "And an important one. I know this wasn't easy, and I want you to know I appreciate your cooperation. We'll take every measure to ensure your protection and preparedness moving forward." The witness thanked her, sounding lighter, almost buoyant, and when the call ended, Julia set the phone down gently, as though sudden movements might shatter the moment. The case was back on track. The weight that had pressed against her chest for days lifted, replaced by something rare and intoxicating: unfiltered joy. She laughed once, quietly, alone in her office, then stood and walked to the window. The city looked different when victory, real victory, felt possible again. On impulse, she made a decision that would have seemed reckless just 48 hours earlier. She was taking lunch. A real one. By noon, she'd decided on her favorite sushi place downtown, a quiet spot with dark wood tables and a chef who knew her order before she spoke. An extended lunch, she told herself. She'd earned it. As she gathered her coat, another thought surfaced, unexpected, insistent. Brian. The memory of Friday evening came back with uncomfortable clarity. Her sharp words, the way his shoulders had stilled, his simple, dignified, "I understand." At the time, she'd justified it as stress, as urgency. Now, with the case revived and her nerves no longer screaming, the exchange sat poorly with her. She picked up the phone and called the lobby for her car service. As she waited for the line to connect, she surprised herself by smiling faintly. Privately, she imagined inviting Brian to join her for lunch, or at least offering to bring him something back. He'd mentioned pizza, after all. Sushi wasn't pizza, but it was a start, an olive branch. The car arrived promptly. Julia descended to the lobby and stepped outside, already preparing what she might say, something concise, sincere, uncharacteristically human. But when the driver opened the door, the face looking back at her was unfamiliar. She paused, one foot still on the pavement. "You're not Brian," she said, not accusingly, just stating a fact. The man smiled politely. "No, ma'am. I'm filling in for the day." Julia slid into the seat, a faint crease forming between her brows. "Do you know where Brian is?" she asked. "I'm just a fill-in driver," he replied evenly. "If you have any further questions, please speak with the lobby manager." The answer was professional, rehearsed, and strangely final. Julia nodded once, though a small, unwelcome chill ran through her. She turned her gaze to the window as the car pulled away, telling herself it meant nothing. People called in sick. Schedules changed. It was none of her business. Still, the thought lingered. At the restaurant, the hostess greeted her warmly, and within minutes, Julia was seated at her usual table. A sake glass appeared, then a neat procession of plates. Tuna, salmon, yellowtail, rolls cut with meticulous precision. The colors were vivid, the presentation flawless. Any other day, she would have savored it. Instead, she found herself distracted. As she lifted her chopsticks, her mind drifted back to the car, to the quiet way the fill-in driver had spoken, to the absence she hadn't expected to notice at all. Day 2 of a new job, she thought. Why wouldn't he be there? She shook her head, annoyed at herself. Her case was back on track. The witness was secured. A dozen of her favorite maki rolls sat untouched in front of her. By any rational metric, this was a perfect afternoon. So why did uneasiness coil in her stomach? She ate slowly, tasting less than she should have, the hum of the restaurant fading in and out. Every so often, her thoughts snagged on the same point. Brian, waiting patiently outside the witness's office, nearly 2 hours without complaint. Brian offering pizza, carefully, almost shyly. Brian accepting her rebuke without protest.
She finished her meal, left a generous tip, and told herself, firmly, that she was overthinking. The ride back to her office was quiet. At first, Julia assumed the silence was her doing, that she'd unconsciously projected a mood. But as the car moved through traffic, she realized something else. She hadn't asked for silence. She hadn't snapped or deflected or shut anything down. The fill-in driver simply didn't speak. No attempt at small talk, no polite questions, no offers, no suggestions. Silence was his default setting. She stared at the city sliding past the window, suddenly aware of how stark the contrast was. Brian's quiet had been intentional, responsive. This silence was procedural, empty. When the car stopped in front of her building, the driver got out, opened the door, and wished her a pleasant afternoon. Julia thanked him automatically, then hesitated on the sidewalk, watching the car pull away. Something felt unfinished. She entered the lobby and slowed her pace. Normally, she would head straight for the elevators, already dialing her next call, mind back in motion. Instead, she stood there for a moment, absorbing the polished marble floors, the low murmur of voices, the rhythm of people coming and going. Then she turned toward the front desk. The receptionist looked up, smiling. "Good afternoon, Julia." Returning the smile, though it felt more fragile than usual. "May I please speak with Sarah?" she asked. The receptionist blinked, surprised, then nodded. "Of course, one moment." As she waited, Julia folded her hands together, her case files momentarily forgotten. She wasn't entirely sure what she planned to ask, or what she hoped to hear. She only knew that something about Brian's absence, about the silence that had replaced him, refused to be ignored. For the first time in days, control felt less important than understanding. The lobby's familiar hush wrapped around Julia as she stood near the front desk, hands loosely clasped, her attention fixed on the frosted glass door behind it. She had expected this to be quick, perfunctory even, but now that she'd asked for Sarah, a strange tension settled in her chest. The kind that arrived not from a looming deadline, but from the sense that something once dismissed as minor had quietly grown teeth. The door opened. Sarah emerged from her back office with a tablet tucked under one arm, her expression professional, but warm. She was in her early 40s, composed in the way of someone who managed both people and problems for a living. When she saw Julia, recognition sparked immediately. "Good afternoon, Julia," Sarah said, stepping forward. "How can I help you?" Julia returned the greeting automatically, though her smile faltered just slightly. There was an odd look on her face now, uncertainty, curiosity, and something close to apprehension braided together. "I was hoping you could tell me," Julia began carefully. "What happened to my driver? Brian. I thought he was newly assigned to me, but today I had someone else." Sarah's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for Julia to notice. A flicker of understanding, followed by something like regret. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience you may have experienced," Sarah said, gently. "Brian actually offered his immediate resignation." The words landed harder than Julia expected. "Resignation," she repeated, the syllables clipped by surprise. Sarah nodded. "Yes." A pause stretched between them. The lobby noise seemed to dim, as if the space itself were waiting. Julia felt a quick, unwelcome twist in her stomach. She hadn't come down expecting this, not really. A scheduling change, perhaps, a sick day, not this. "I see," Julia said, then hesitated. Anxious curiosity rose in her, sharp and insistent, but she tempered it quickly. She was well aware of how easily questions could sound like demands. "Did he say why?" Sarah's shoulders relaxed a fraction, as if she'd anticipated the question. "He didn't offer much information," she said. "Only his apologies for having to resign so suddenly. He told us he wouldn't be able to continue working as a driver with us." Julia absorbed this in silence. "Brian gave notice Friday evening,"
Sarah continued, her tone neutral but attentive. "Shortly after returning from his trip with you." The timing struck like a bell. Friday evening. Julia's mind replayed the scene uninvited. The car, the traffic lights, her words, precise, dismissive, sharp as a blade carefully honed. She had meant them to end the conversation. She hadn't meant them to end something else. Sarah studied her for a moment, then asked, gently but directly, "Did you notice anything abnormal with Brian that evening? Anything that may have contributed to this decision?" Julia inhaled slowly. She could feel the instinct to deflect rising immediately, the well-practiced impulse to offer something vague and polished. But the truth pressed close to the surface, uncomfortable and insistent. "I don't want to get into specifics," Julia said, choosing each word with care, "but it's possible Brian wasn't happy with me that evening." Sarah nodded, not surprised. If anything, her expression softened. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. Julia hesitated again, then spoke before she could talk herself out of it. "Would you happen to have any contact information for him?" she asked, "just so I could reach out, see if he's all right." The request hung there, naked in its sincerity. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She glanced briefly at the front desk, then back at Julia, her professional instincts clearly at work. When she spoke, her voice was apologetic, but firm. "I'm afraid I can't share Brian's personal contact information," she said. "Company privacy policy." Julia nodded, disappointment flickering across her face. "Of course, I understand." But Sarah didn't quite leave it there. She shifted her tablet to her other arm and lowered her voice slightly. "That said," she added, "Brian did list a reference when he applied, Little Sicily's Pizzeria. He worked there previously, and we verified his employment." Julia looked up. Sarah reached for a pen and a small notepad beneath the desk. "I can give you the address," she said. "That's public information." For a moment, Julia simply watched as Sarah wrote. The motion felt oddly significant, as though a door she hadn't known existed was quietly being unlocked. This wasn't about logistics anymore. It was about the space between intention and impact, about realizing, too late, that words could linger far longer than a drive across town. Sarah tore the paper free and handed it to her. Julia took it carefully, as though it might dissolve between her fingers. "Thank you," she said, meaning it far more deeply than the phrase usually carried. Sarah met her gaze, a note of understanding passing between them. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you're the first client to forget that drivers are people too. But you may be one of the few who noticed afterward." Julia nodded once, unable to disagree. She folded the paper and slipped it into her coat pocket, then straightened, her familiar composure returning, but altered now, threaded with something new. "Thank you, Sarah," she said again. As she turned toward the elevators, the lobby resumed its ordinary rhythm. But for Julia, something fundamental had shifted. The case was back on track. The trial loomed. Control, once again, was within reach. And yet, for the first time in a long while, she found herself willing, almost compelled, to step briefly off her path, to see where a quiet detour might lead. The following day unfolded with a reassuring sense of order, the kind Julia relied on to remind herself who she was when circumstances threatened to erode the edges. Morning light filtered cleanly through her office windows as she settled into her desk chair, coffee steaming within reach, her mind already moving several steps ahead. She began with the witness. The call was efficient, professional, and, most importantly, grounded. They reviewed timelines, clarified testimony points, and reaffirmed expectations. The hesitation that had plagued them the previous week was gone, replaced by cautious resolve. Julia listened closely, offering reassurance without pressure, encouragement without condescension. When the call ended, she allowed herself a small nod. This was how it was supposed to feel: steady, aligned, forward-moving. She spent the next several hours immersed in case files, yellow tabs bristling from folders like spines. She cross-referenced bank statements, reread deposition excerpts, and refined her outline for direct examination. The work was absorbing, almost meditative. Each document fit into the larger structure she had been building for months, and with every confirmation, her confidence deepened. Late in the afternoon, she called the court clerk to confirm procedural details, filing deadlines, exhibit numbering, a minor scheduling adjustment. The conversation was cordial and brief, ending with mutual thanks and a clear understanding of next steps. By the time Julia glanced at the clock again, dusk was settling in. The city outside her window had softened, the sharp angles of daylight giving way to warmer tones. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time in days, she felt satisfied. Not euphoric, not triumphant, just quietly, thoroughly satisfied with the work she had done. The case was moving. She was prepared. The machinery was humming again. Her stomach reminded her, firmly, that she had skipped lunch. Without much deliberation, Julia reached for her phone and opened the Uber app. She typed in the address she'd memorized almost without realizing it, Little Sicily's Pizzeria. She told herself it was convenient, that she wanted something quick and familiar. She did not interrogate the deeper motivations too closely. Some instincts, she was learning, didn't respond well to cross-examination. The ride over was uneventful. The driver made polite conversation about traffic and weather. Julia responded with courteous brevity, her thoughts drifting elsewhere. When the car pulled up in front of the modest storefront, she thanked him and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Little Sicily's was exactly what she expected. Warm light spilling through the windows, the smell of baked dough and tomato sauce thick in the air. Inside, the decor was simple: checkered floor tiles, faded photographs of New York streets, a chalkboard menu written in looping script. She took a seat at the counter, pulling up a wooden stool that creaked slightly under her weight. When the cashier approached, she ordered without hesitation. "1 New York-style slice," she said, "and a Diet Coke." The food came quickly. The slice was generous, the crust crisp but pliable, the cheese stretching just enough when she lifted it. Julia ate slowly, deliberately, savoring the simplicity of it. No strategy, no stakes, just dinner. She was nearly finished, blotting her fingers with a napkin, when the front door swung open and a gust of cooler evening air swept in. One of the delivery drivers entered, moving with the easy familiarity of someone who had done this routine countless times. He wore jeans, a white t-shirt, and a red and white cap emblazoned with Little Sicily across the front. It was Brian. Julia's breath caught before she could stop it. He didn't see her at first. Focused on the register, Brian handed over a small wad of cash, exchanging a few quick words with the cashier as change was counted out. He moved with quiet efficiency, the same unassuming competence she remembered from behind the wheel. Julia sat frozen, her half-empty plate forgotten. She watched him with an intensity that surprised her, noticed the faint stubble along his jaw, the way his shoulders squared as he tucked the receipt into his pocket. It took him a moment. Then, as if sensing something, Brian glanced toward the counter. Their eyes met. The recognition was instantaneous and fleeting. There was no surprise on his face, no flicker of acknowledgement beyond the briefest pause. He gave her nothing more than a glance, then turned away, collecting 2 pizza boxes and the delivery slip for his next run.
Without a word, he headed for the door. It closed behind him before Julia could even think to stand. For a heartbeat, she sat there, stunned by the speed of it, by the completeness of the dismissal. Then something sharp flared inside her, an instinctive, reflexive indignation. The nerve, she thought, the attitude. To ignore her like that, to treat her as if she were invisible. She caught herself mid-thought. High-profile attorney, a voice in her head supplied, dripping with irony, as if that explained anything. Heat rose to her cheeks, not from anger alone, but from the sudden, crushing awareness of how easily she had slipped into the very posture she'd been questioning. Pizza boy. The phrase surfaced unbidden, ugly and unfair, and just as quickly, shame followed it. She stared down at her plate, appetite gone. Just days earlier, she had reduced Brian to a function, a service, a means of transportation. She had dismissed his attempt at kindness as creative, unwarranted. And now, having tracked him here under the guise of concern, she'd bristled at being afforded the same cold efficiency she herself had delivered. The guilt pressed heavier than before. Julia paid her bill, left the counter, and moved to a small table near the wall where she could see the door clearly. She folded her hands together, then unfolded them. Her heart beat faster than it had during any argument that day. He would be back, she reasoned. Delivery drivers always came back, and when he did, she would speak to him. Not as a client, not as an attorney, but as a person who owed another person something long overdue. She committed herself to waiting. Julia checked her watch for what felt like the 10th time. 45 minutes. She had not planned on waiting this long. When she first slid into the small table by the wall, she'd told herself it would be 10, maybe 15 minutes at most. A quick turnaround delivery, in and out. But the minutes stretched, folding in on themselves, and the pizzeria's steady rhythm continued without Brian's return. She tried to be rational about it. It was early evening now, edging toward peak hours. Traffic would be thick, commuters still clogging the main arteries, double-parked cars forcing detours. A delivery could easily run long. Maybe 2 orders stacked together. Maybe an address mix-up. Maybe someone arguing over change. All perfectly reasonable explanations. And yet, she sat there anyway, hands folded around an empty glass, resisting the urge to fidget. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who measured her days in 6-minute increments, was voluntarily doing nothing. Just waiting, letting time pass without controlling it. It was uncomfortable. It was humbling. She thought again of Friday night, the impatience in her voice, the precision of her dismissal. She had been so certain then, so sure of her position in the world and his in it. Now, sitting on a vinyl chair in a pizza place she had no business frequenting, that certainty felt thin, brittle. The bell above the door finally jingled. Julia's head lifted instinctively. Brian stepped inside. This time, there was no delay, no distracted glance. The moment he crossed the threshold, his eyes found hers. Immediate, intentional. His expression didn't change. No warmth, no irritation, but something in his posture shifted, as if a decision had already been made. He moved with efficiency, slipping behind the counter to drop off the insulated bag, exchanging a few quick words with the man working the oven. Julia couldn't hear them, but she saw Brian gesture subtly in her direction. His boss nodded. Brian turned back toward her. He walked over and stopped a respectful distance away. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even. "Would you please step outside with me for a minute?" Julia blinked, caught off guard, not by the request, but by the manner. Polite, controlled, the same steadiness she remembered from the driver's seat. A small, unexpected thought crossed her mind. Even now, even here, his manners were intact. "Yes," she said promptly, standing. "Of course." They stepped outside together, the door closing softly behind them. The street was cooler now, the sky dimming into evening, neon signs flickering on one by one. For a moment, neither spoke. Brian didn't waste it. "What was your motive for being here?" he asked directly. The question was calm, not accusatory, which somehow made it land harder. "You finished your food a long time ago," he continued, "and I know how busy you are. The last thing you said to me Friday was, I wish I had time to pursue trivial matters like pizza. He met her eyes squarely, and now here you are, sitting down, waiting, wasting time. Julia felt the words hit, each one precise, undeniable. Her instinct, sharp, well-trained, was to counter, to explain efficiently, to reframe. But something stopped her. For the first time in a very long time, she was on the defensive. She hated it. She hated the way her pulse quickened, the way her mind raced, not just to find an answer, but to shape it. This wasn't a courtroom where facts alone carried the day. This was unfamiliar territory, where tone mattered as much as substance, and where the wrong phrasing could undo the very thing she'd come here to do. Julia inhaled slowly.
I've been under a great deal of stress, she began, choosing honesty over elegance. The case I'm handling, it wasn't going well on Friday. Things were unraveling. She paused, grounding herself. But over the last 24 hours, everything fell into place. The witness recommitted, the procedural issues resolved. I'm in a much better spot now than I was then. She looked at him fully. And I realized afterward that the way I spoke to you wasn't fair. I wanted to make sure there was no ill will between us. Ryan listened without interrupting. His face was unreadable, but attentive. When she finished, he took a brief moment himself, no more than a heartbeat, then spoke. Rest assured, he said, meeting her gaze, there is no ill will between the two of us. Nor will there ever be. Julia felt a flicker of relief, which vanished with his next words. With that being said, Ryan continued evenly, I'd like to now ask you to leave. This is my place of employment, and by your own admission, you don't belong here. He paused, just long enough for the boundary to settle. I wish you the best of luck, Julia. There was no bitterness in his voice, no edge, just finality. He gave a slight nod, turned, and walked back inside to retrieve his next delivery. Julia stood motionless on the sidewalk. The door closed. The sounds of the restaurant resumed as if nothing of consequence had happened at all. Cars passed. Someone laughed across the street. Life moved forward, indifferent. She replayed his words, not angrily, not defensively, but with a strange clarity. No ill will. A boundary. A quiet refusal to let her rewrite the terms simply because she was ready now. For once, there was no argument to make, no appeal to authority, no closing statement that could alter the outcome. She pulled out her phone and called an Uber. When the car arrived, she climbed in and leaned back against the seat. As the city lights blurred past the window, Julia did something she rarely allowed herself. She sat with the consequences of her words and let the silence carry her home. The next 3 days at the office were, by any reasonable measure, a mess. Not the dramatic kind, no blown deadlines, no public confrontations, no obvious implosions. That almost made it worse. On the surface, Julia was still showing up, still dressed impeccably, still speaking with authority. But beneath that veneer, something essential had slipped out of alignment. Focus, maybe, or certainty, or the quiet internal rhythm that had always kept her several steps ahead of everyone else. Simply put, they were the 3 most unproductive days she'd had in years. On Wednesday morning, she was prepping a client for cross-examination in a smaller, unrelated case, routine work she could usually do on autopilot. She reached into her briefcase for her annotated notes, the ones with color-coded tabs and margin reminders, and felt her stomach drop. They weren't there. She checked again, slowly, methodically, as if repetition might will them into existence. Nothing. The realization came with a delayed sting. The notes were still on her coffee table at home, neatly stacked beside a cold mug she vaguely remembered setting down days ago. She felt a flush of irritation rise.
Not at the mistake itself, but at the fact that she'd made it at all. Julia did not forget her notes. Ever. She recovered, of course. She always did. She improvised, leaned on memory, and no one in the room would have guessed anything was amiss. But as she left the conference room later, she felt unsettled. A hairline fracture had formed in her self-image, thin but unmistakable. Thursday was worse. She overslept. Not dramatically, no blaring alarms ignored for hours, but enough. 15 minutes late for a conference call with the firm's partners, a meeting she herself had helped schedule. The topic was significant, moving the firm's main office to a larger space downtown. Growth, expansion, visibility. The firm had nearly doubled in size over the last 3 years, due in no small part to Julia's success as a master litigator. She had built her reputation on reliability as much as brilliance. Being late wasn't just out of character, it was unthinkable. When she joined the call, breath slightly uneven, apologies crisp but sincere, there was a brief pause on the line. No one reprimanded her. No one even commented. But Julia felt it all the same, like a spotlight she couldn't quite escape. Friday, she didn't even try. She called out. She had her assistant clear her schedule entirely, citing a severe headache. That part was true. Her temples throbbed with a dull insistence that made light feel intrusive and sound abrasive. What she did not mention, what she carefully avoided considering too closely herself, was the empty bottle of Robert Mondavi sitting in her kitchen sink, consumed in its entirety the night before. It wasn't something she typically did. A glass with dinner, maybe 2 on particularly long nights. This had been different. This had been numbing, intentional. The kind of drinking that wasn't about taste or ritual, but about silence. Now she lay in bed, curtains drawn, phone face down on the nightstand. The headache pulsed in time with her thoughts, which refused to settle into anything orderly. None of this made sense to her. Julia did not unravel over small interactions. She had faced down hostile witnesses, aggressive opposing counsel, entire courtrooms primed to doubt her. She had lost cases before, real losses, with consequences far more tangible than wounded pride, and she had absorbed them, learned, moved on. So why couldn't she shake this? Lying there, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling she'd never bothered to fix, she tried to rationalize her current state of affairs. She approached it the only way she knew how, analytically. On what grounds did Brian become an authority figure in my life? The question annoyed her as soon as it surfaced. Authority implied power, influence. Brian had neither, at least not in any traditional sense. He wasn't a superior. He wasn't a peer. He wasn't even part of her professional world. Did he really think of me as that bad of a person? That one landed harder.
She replayed the words he'd spoken outside the pizzeria. Calm, measured, final. No ill will. A boundary. A dismissal that wasn't cruel, but wasn't kind either. Just firm. Is it possible that he's not even thinking about me at all? That thought made her chest tighten in a way she didn't appreciate. Because it was plausible. Worse, it was likely. People like Brian moved on. They didn't ruminate. They didn't replay conversations in their heads days later, dissecting tone and intent. And then came the worst question, the one she couldn't quite bring herself to accept. What if all of it is true? What if she had been exactly as dismissive, as demeaning, as small as the memory suggested? What if Brian's reaction wasn't oversensitive or misinterpreted, but proportionate? What if the version of herself she'd glimpsed through his eyes was one she'd been avoiding for years?
The headache throbbed harder. Eventually, she forced herself out of bed and into the shower. Hot water pounded against her shoulders, steam filling the bathroom, washing away the lingering haze of wine and sleeplessness. She stood there longer than necessary, letting the physical sensation anchor her. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel, hair damp and curling at the ends, something had shifted. She had reached a conclusion. If she was going to quiet the noise in her head, if she was going to reclaim even a fraction of the focus she'd lost, she was going to have to see Brian again. Just one more time. Not to persuade him of anything, not to rewrite the past, but to clear the air, to right the ship if such a thing was still possible. The thought brought a surprising mix of relief and anxiety. She sat on the edge of her bed and began to brainstorm, and immediately hated the comparison that sprang to mind. She felt like a teenage schoolgirl with a crush on the varsity quarterback. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. He quit his job as my driver, she thought. He asked me not to come back to his other job, all in an effort to not have to see me. The implications were not subtle. Have I eliminated all of my options? She ran through them anyway. Showing up at the car service again, unacceptable and futile. Returning to the pizzeria uninvited, he had been explicit. Calling the firm to track him down, unethical at best, humiliating at worst. She closed her eyes, rubbing her temples. Then she paused. No, there was one more. Not an ideal choice, not elegant, but it existed. I can order a pizza. The simplicity of it startled her. It slipped past her defences before she could dismiss it. A delivery, ordinary, anonymous. He wouldn't know it was her. He didn't know where she lived. He'd assume it was just like any other order. She stood and paced the length of her bedroom, the idea taking shape, refining itself. I'll place the order under a pseudonym. J. Plain, unremarkable, even a little conspicuous in its effort to be anonymous. She imagined it, the knock at the door, the brief exchange, the moment of recognition. She'd only need a couple of minutes, just enough time to say what she hadn't said properly before, to apologize without conditions, to leave nothing unsaid. That'll open the door one final time, she told herself, giving me the opportunity to finally make this right. She stopped pacing. The plan was imperfect, risky, possibly misguided. But for the first time in days, her thoughts aligned into something resembling resolve. Julia reached for her phone and called Little Sicily's restaurant.
After 2 rings, the line clicked alive. "Little Sicily," a voice proclaimed, thick with a heavy Italian accent that carried both authority and warmth. Julia didn't need to ask who it was. She could picture him instantly. Vinny, the owner, Brian's boss, the man who had nodded permission with a single glance the night she'd been asked to leave. "Order for delivery, please," Julia said, her voice calm despite the quickened beat of her heart. "What can I get you?" Vinny replied. "I'd like to order 1 large, plain New York-style cheese." "Anything else?" "Nope, that'll be all." There was a brief pause, the scratch of pen on paper. "Name and address, please." "J," Julia said, the pseudonym slipping out smoothly. 1735 Main Street, apartment 1501. "Cash or card?" "Cash, please." "Okay," Vinny said. "Give us about 35 to 40 minutes. "Thank you," Julia replied. She hung up before she could overthink it. The apartment felt unusually quiet once the call ended, as if it were holding its breath alongside her. Julia set her phone down and looked around, suddenly unsure what to do with herself. On impulse, she turned on the television. Netflix loaded. Rows of thumbnails scrolled past, shows she'd never watched, names she barely recognized. She landed on a stand-up comedy special almost by accident and pressed play. It had been months since she'd turned on the TV. At first, she watched passively, half expecting her mind to wander back to case law or timelines. But it didn't. The comedian's voice filled the room, casual and sharp, observations tumbling out in a rhythm that felt oddly soothing. Julia found herself leaning back on the couch. She smiled. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, out loud. The sound startled her. She brought a hand to her mouth as if someone might hear her through the walls. When was the last time I laughed like that? She wondered briefly. Then the next punchline landed, and she laughed again, harder this time. In the span of days, her behavior had shifted in ways she would have once found alarming. Watching television, laughing, ordering pizza, and not just any pizza. She was actually looking forward to it. The slice she'd had at Little Sicily's had been better than she wanted to admit, and now the anticipation curled pleasantly in her stomach. The time flew by, completely. She lost track of minutes, then entire segments of the show, absorbed in a world where the stakes were low and the reward was simple amusement. Then the intercom buzzed. "Pizza delivery for you, Julia," the doorman's voice crackled through. "Should I send them up?" "Yes, please," she said quickly. Her heart rate jumped. She sprang up, remote in hand. Pause Netflix. Check. TV off. Check. She hurried to the bathroom and splashed warm water on her face, studying her reflection. Did that last joke actually make me cry? She wondered, noticing the faint redness around her eyes. She smiled at herself, just a little. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. A minute, maybe 2. When the knock finally came, sharp and polite, Julia smoothed her hair and opened the door. The person standing there was not Brian. It was a girl, young, startlingly so, with green hair pulled into a messy ponytail and a small silver nose ring that caught the light. A rose tattoo bloomed across her left forearm, vibrant against pale skin. She looked just old enough to have qualified for her driver's license yesterday. $14, please, the girl said. Julia handed over a 20. Keep the change.
Thanks, the girl replied, already turning away. The door closed softly. Julia stood there for a moment, pizza box warm in her hands, absorbing the disappointment without letting it sink too deep. In the back of her mind, she'd known this was a possibility. Brian might not be on deliveries, might be off that night, might never deliver to her building at all. It was fine. I charge $500 an hour for my services, she thought dryly. I can order another pizza. She set the box on the counter, took a slice, and returned to the couch. The comedy special resumed, and she finished it, laughing again, though with a faint undercurrent of restlessness now. When the credits rolled, she checked the time. 2 hours had passed. On impulse, or perhaps stubbornness, she called Little Sicily's again and ordered another pie. The delivery arrived as promised. This time, it was a heavy-set man in his early 50s, cheeks flushed from the cold, expression friendly but tired. "Here you go," he said. Julia handed him a 20. "Thank you." She placed the untouched pizza in the fridge beside the first and called it a night. At noon the following day, she ordered again. Same result, same heavy-set man. At 4 o'clock, another delivery. This time the green-haired girl returned, grinning as she handed over the box. At 5, Julia opened her refrigerator for a couple of strawberries and froze. The bright red container was buried behind 4 large cheese pizzas, stacked like an absurd monument to poor decision-making. She stared at them, hands on the fridge door, and sighed. This is not going to plan. For the first time since she'd started this strange campaign, doubt crept in. She considered changing tactics, abandoning the whole thing, admitting defeat, letting Brian remain a closed chapter. Then another thought followed, quieter but persistent. One more time. At about 10 o'clock, she placed the order again. Maybe Brian had the graveyard shift. Maybe tonight would be different. The routine repeated itself.
The doorman called up, the elevator chimed, footsteps approached, and a knock at the door. But this time, Julia didn't open the door right away. An intuition, sharp, insistent, stopped her hand inches from the knob. She leaned forward and looked through the peephole. It took only one glance. It was him. Julia paused. It was only a second, maybe two. But in that space, she did what she had always done best. She centered herself. Shoulders back, breath steady. Face composed into something calm, measured, unreadable. The same internal switch she flipped when deposing a hostile witness or standing before a jury that needed to believe every word she was about to say. Control, composure, precision. She opened the door. Brian stood there holding a large white pizza box, steam faintly curling from the edges. For a split second, neither of them moved. Then his eyes lifted and locked onto hers. "Julia?" he said. The confusion in his voice was unmistakable, genuine. He hadn't expected this, not tonight, not ever, perhaps. Whatever he had braced himself for when he took this delivery, it had not been her. "Hi, Brian," Julia said, smoothly, working to match his astonishment with something light, almost casual. "It's good to see you." Even as she said it, a part of her marveled at the audacity of the moment. Delivering a pizza, standing in her doorway, acting as if this were all coincidence, some harmless accident of fate, rather than the carefully constructed outcome of multiple phone calls, strategic timing, and more self-interrogation than she'd done in years. "Please," she added quickly, stepping aside. "Come in. You can put the pizza in the kitchen and have a seat. I just need to get the money out of my purse in the bedroom." Brian hesitated, only briefly, then nodded. Polite. Habitual. He stepped inside, following her directions with the same quiet compliance he'd always shown her. She turned and walked toward her bedroom. The moment she was out of his sight, the composure cracked. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, one of several she'd prepared, folded neatly, ready to hand over. The simplest path, the cleanest exit. And the wrong one. If she handed him the money now, he would take it. He would thank her politely. He would leave. The elevator doors would close, and whatever unfinished business lived between them would calcify into permanence. She closed her eyes, the bill still between her fingers. No. She needed him to wait. Just a moment. Long enough for her to speak, not as an attorney, not as a client, not as someone in control of the outcome, but as herself. Whatever that meant now. She left the money on the dresser and walked back out. Brian was standing near the kitchen counter, hands loosely at his sides. He looked up when she returned. "You know," Julia began, not bothering to sit, "it really is good to see you." Brian's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Is it?" The question was simple, but it landed with weight. "Of course it is," Julia said, a faint blush rising despite her efforts. Silly question. She felt his eyes on her, steady, focused, perceptive. The same gaze that had unsettled her outside the pizzeria. She resisted the urge to fill the silence with legal polish. "I wanted to talk to you," she continued. "I was hoping you might reconsider taking your job back with the car service." Brian's expression didn't change, but something sharpened behind his eyes. "You said you were looking forward to the opportunity," Julia went on, choosing her words carefully, "and I didn't want any misinterpretations that may have come from our time together last week to keep you from pursuing that." "Misinterpretation," Brian repeated. "Yes," she said quickly. "I know we got off on the wrong foot, and I know I likely came off as too abrasive, though maybe that's too generous a word from your perspective. You probably think worse of me." She took a breath. This part was harder than she'd expected. "So please, Brian, consider this my attempt to make amends. I can get your job back. I can make sure you're reassigned, and maybe, if you're willing, you and I could develop a more positive working relationship." She paused, then added, softer now, "I'd like another shot at taking you up on that pizza offer.
if you were to extend it again. The words hung there, exposed. You don't have to answer right now, she said. You can take as much time as you need. The offer stands. She waited. It didn't take Brian very long to understand what was really happening. This wasn't fate. This wasn't coincidence. He saw it in the way she stood, too still, too composed, in the way her voice carried just enough warmth to mask the vulnerability underneath. Julia, master litigator, had built her life on guarding against moments just like this. Vulnerability. The thing she feared more than losing a case, more than public failure, more than heartbreak, perhaps even more than death itself. The idea that another human being might see her as an exposed, unarmored human being. Brian had no illusions about his place in her world, but he also knew something she hadn't yet fully accepted. Power didn't only belong to those with titles, money, or command of a room. Sometimes it belonged to the person who could see clearly and refuse to exploit what they saw. He studied her for a moment longer. Then he spoke. I can answer now, Brian said quietly, meeting her eyes. Brian didn't move farther into the apartment. He stayed where he was, near the counter, the pizza box still between them, like a quiet reminder of why he was there at all. He glanced once toward the door, then back at Julia, as if orienting himself not to the space, but to the time he had left in it. Before I get started, Julia, he said evenly, I need to say something. The pizzeria closes in about 20 minutes. It'll take me at least 15 to get across town with favorable traffic, so please, give me the opportunity to speak. The request wasn't confrontational, it was logistical, honest. Julia nodded gently, immediately. Of course. Brian took a breath. Not a dramatic one, just enough to steady himself. I've known Vinny since I was a little kid, he began. My mum used to bring me into the shop after school. He'd give me a slice, tell me to stay out of trouble. I started working there for real when I was 16, been there on and off ever since. He gave a small, almost apologetic smile. I couldn't afford college. Never really wanted to go, if I'm being honest. I like working with my hands. I like knowing where I'm supposed to be and when. Vinny gave me that. The shop gave me that. Julia listened without interrupting, her posture still, attentive. When I saw the ad for a driver position at a law firm, Brian continued, I almost scrolled past it. Prestigious law firm, professional environment, all that. Didn't feel like it was meant for someone like me. But I put a resume together anyway. Nothing fancy. Sent it through Indeed. He shook his head slightly, as if remembering the feeling. When they called me in for an interview, I was excited in a way I hadn't been in a long time. Like maybe something was changing. He looked at Julia now, not searching her face, just acknowledging her presence. And when Sarah called me the next day and said, Brian, we'd like to offer you the position. If you can start tomorrow, we need to fill it immediately. He paused, letting the words sit. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Julia felt something tighten behind her ribs. My first day's itinerary seemed simple enough, Brian went on. Bring Mr. Dawson to the airport at 10 for his afternoon flight. On the way back, swing by Linda's bakery to pick up cakes and pastries for the lounge conference room. Some important meeting, I guess. A faint smile crossed his face. And then, my third and final assignment, wait for Julia for an afternoon client meeting. Round trip. He exhaled. I remember asking Sarah, who's Julia? Julia's lips parted slightly, surprised by the question even now. She said, she's a partner at the firm on the 5th floor. Her photo's on the wall by the elevator. Take a look so you know who she is when she comes down. Be courteous, be polite, be ready to do as she asks. He chuckled quietly. She finished by saying, you know, your default setting. Sarah's a really special person. Julia nodded once. She knew that already.
So I went and looked at your photo, Ryan said, and that was the first time in a very long time that I got nervous. Julia frowned slightly. Why would you say that? Ryan didn't hesitate. Because you're absolutely stunning in that photo, he said plainly. And you're even more beautiful in person, both then and now. Julia felt heat rise to her face, immediate and undeniable. She opened her mouth, but he continued before she could respond. I was afraid I wouldn't be smart enough, he said. I was afraid I wouldn't be fast enough. But more than anything, I was afraid I wouldn't be good enough. He lifted a hand slightly, as if to clarify. And I don't mean good enough for you specifically. I mean for what you represent. And who's that? Julia asked softly. Ryan met her eyes. An elite class of people, he said, who make all the money, who control all the opportunities, who make all the decisions, who hold all the power. His voice didn't carry bitterness, just certainty. I know who I am as a person, he continued, and I'm proud of that person. But this was the first time I was going to find out if that person was good enough to work, even in the most subordinate role, with someone like you. The silence that followed was heavy, unhurried. Julia felt it stretch, not awkwardly, but deliberately, like something unfinished had been placed carefully between them. Brian stood there, having said more in a few minutes than he ever had to Vinny, the man he considered family, more than he had to anyone. He didn't rush to fill the space. Julia finally tried to speak. And you found out, she said quietly. I found out I was not, Brian replied, cutting in gently but firmly. Julia's breath caught. Not what? Not good enough, he said. She searched his face, trying to reconcile the words with the man standing in front of her. And I don't mean that literally, Ryan added, not in terms of the things I thought mattered growing up. Hard work, intelligence, kindness. He shook his head once. When I say not good enough, I mean I don't have what it takes to say the words you said to me last week. I don't have it in me to conjure up a plan like this one, offering someone their job back after they quit, as restitution. His voice didn't rise, it didn't accuse, it simply stated. And I keep asking myself, he continued, quieter now, why couldn't you have just said you were sorry instead? Julia couldn't make eye contact. She stared at the hardwood floor between them, at a faint scuff mark she didn't remember earning, at the shadow cast by the kitchen light that cut across Brian's shoes. Her hands hung uselessly at her sides, fingers curled slightly inward as if they were trying to disappear. Brian's words had stripped her of language. Her law degree, earned with honours, nearly a decade of relentless litigation, the accolades, the verdicts, the promotions, the youngest partner in her firm's history, the woman whose name made opposing counsel adjust their posture and double-check their notes. None of it mattered here. None of it had been enough to protect her from a man she'd known for barely more than a week. Brian had seen straight through her. Not the polished exterior she presented to judges and juries, not the authority she wielded so effortlessly in conference rooms, but the fragile architecture underneath, the carefully engineered distance, the control she clung to not because it made her powerful, but because it kept her safe. He had made her vulnerable, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do about it now. She had played her last card. The silence stretched. Nearly a full minute passed, though it felt longer, as if time itself had slowed to watch what she would do next. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, breath shallow, restrained. Every instinct screamed at her to recover footing, to say something clever, something disarming, something that would regain control of the moment. Instead, what came out was predictable, weak, and she knew it the instant the words left her mouth.
I'm not sure what it is you expect me to say, Brian. The sentence hung there, limp and exposed. She hated herself for it. She absolutely knew that this response would only invite further unraveling. It was the kind of deflection she'd perfected over years, passive, evasive, technically reasonable while avoiding the real issue entirely. The disrespect, the lies, the manipulation. The fact that she had engineered this entire encounter under the guise of coincidence because she hadn't been brave enough to do the one thing Brian had named so clearly. Say, I'm sorry. Everything was now on the table, in plain sight, ready to be analysed, engaged, escalated. Julia braced herself for the argument she deserved, the sharp rebuke, the moral accounting, the emotional indictment that would finally strip her bare. It didn't come. Brian exhaled quietly. Then, in the same steady tone he'd used outside the pizzeria days earlier, he spoke. "Julia," he said, "please look up." The request was gentle, respectful, from his perspective. From hers it was devastating, but also, like hers, predictable. Her jaw tightened. For a split second she considered refusing, clinging to the last scrap of control available to her. But that too would be a performance, another dodge. Slowly, she lifted her head. Their eyes met. There was no anger in his, no satisfaction, no triumph. Just resolve. "Julia," Brian said, "I'm now asking you for the second time. Please discontinue any further business at my place of employment." Her breath caught. "There are hundreds of pizza places in this city," he continued. "Please choose any of them. Just not this one." The words were measured, final, unnegotiable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't linger to ensure the message landed. He simply turned around and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft, ordinary click. Julia didn't move. She stood there, frozen, staring at the space he had occupied seconds earlier. Her hand was clenched around the $20 bill she had never managed to give him. It was wrinkled now, damp with sweat, the edges soft from being crushed too tightly for too long. He hadn't taken it. The meaning of that settled slowly, inexorably. 2 days, 5 large New York-style pizzas, 1 unpaid pizza tab, and a confession from a man, self-admittedly, she barely knew. That was all it took. After a moment, she wasn't sure how long, Julia walked towards the door and locked it. The sound echoed in the quiet apartment, final and hollow. She picked up the last untouched cheese pizza from the counter, still warm, and placed it what was now the last of her refrigerator space. She shut off the lights and went into her bedroom. And then, finally, when there was no one left to perform for, no argument left to win, no strategy left to deploy, Julia lied down of her bed, got under the covers, and cried. She cried uncontrollably. She cried for the words she hadn't said when they mattered, for the apology she had dressed up as restitution, for the man who had refused her power without cruelty, for the version of herself she could no longer pretend didn't exist. She cried all night long. Brian grew up in a single-parent household, though that phrase always felt too neat, too clinical to capture what it really meant. His father left just before his 2nd birthday, early enough that Brian never formed memories of him, but late enough that his absence left an outline that never quite faded. The only tangible thing Brian had of his father was a photograph his mother kept tucked inside a thin cardboard frame on the top shelf of their hallway closet. It was a sun-washed picture, slightly out of focus, of a man smiling broadly while pushing a toddler on a swing. Ryan's legs were frozen mid-air, sneakers too big for his feet, his face caught between laughter and surprise. The swing set sat in a small park 2 blocks from the single-bedroom apartment Brian would grow up in. As a child, Brian studied that photograph the way some kids studied maps. He tried to memorize the curve of his father's smile, the casual ease of his posture, as if understanding those details might somehow explain why the man hadn't stayed. His mother never spoke badly of his father. She simply said, "He wasn't ready," and left it at that. His mother worked as a dental assistant halfway across the city. Every weekday morning, no matter the weather, she walked Brian down to the bus stop. He would get on his bus, she would get on hers, and they would wave through the fogged-up glass until the vehicles pulled away in opposite directions. After school, Brian had a couple of hours to kill before his mother got home. Most days, he went straight back to the apartment, dropped his backpack by the door, and sat at the small kitchen table to do his homework. Other days, he played video games on his PlayStation, an old console his mother had bought second-hand after months of saving. She could barely afford it, but she'd decided it was essential. Not because she believed video games mattered, but because she believed Brian did. Because a boy with so little deserved something that felt like joy, without conditions. Every Friday after school, with his mother's permission, Brian walked over to Little Sicily's. The ritual never changed. The bell above the door would jingle, the smell of dough and tomato sauce would wrap around him, and before Brian could even take 2 steps inside, Vinny would already be reaching for a paper plate. Plain cheese slice, small Coke. Like clockwork. Vinny didn't have a family of his own. He came to the United States as a young man in the late 1970s with little more than a suitcase and a willingness to work. For 2 years, he learned the pizza business from the ground up, working brutal hours for barely above minimum wage. He saved relentlessly, scraping together nearly $5,000, dollar by dollar. Then he took his shot at the American dream. Little Sicily's wasn't much when he first opened it. A narrow storefront, a handful of mismatched tables, a register that jammed if you didn't hit the buttons just right. But it was his. And he ran it with a quiet pride that never needed to announce itself. As Brian got older, he began helping Vinny around the shop on weekends. At first, it was small things, folding pizza boxes, wiping tables, carrying plates to customers who smiled at him like he was part of the place. By his early teens, he was running the register, learning the rhythm of the orders, the shorthand of the kitchen. Later came making pizzas in the back, stretching dough, watching the oven, understanding the timing that couldn't be rushed. Sometimes, if Vinny had an errand to run, Brian closed the store by himself, locked the door, counted the till, turned off the lights. The money he saved didn't go far, but it went where it mattered. For his mother's 40th birthday, Brian bought her a navy blue dress and a matching purse. It took him months to afford them. She cried when she opened the box, holding the fabric like it was something fragile and sacred. She loved sushi, so Brian took her to the fancy place downtown, the one with the dim lighting and the menu without pictures. It was far more than he could afford, but he paid the bill without hesitation. He loved his mother. That had never been a question. When Brian got his license shortly after turning 17, it was Vinny who lent him the $4,000 he needed to buy his first car. There was no contract, no paperwork, just an understanding. Every week for a year, when Vinny paid Brian his wages, Brian handed $80 back to him. No reminders were needed, no excuses were offered. The agreement was simple. By his 18th birthday, the car would be Brian's outright. 1 week before that birthday, Brian made the final payment. He greeted Vinny with a wide smile and a hug that lingered just a second longer than usual. "Thank you, Vinny," he said. Thank you for everything. Vinny grunted, waved it off like it was nothing, then disappeared into the back for a moment. When he returned, he handed Brian a shoebox, poorly wrapped. Vinny was never big on presentation. Inside was $4,000 in cash. Every payment Brian had made returned to sender. "Happy 18th birthday," Vinny said. "You're legally a man now," he added with a chuckle. Brian didn't know what to say. He hugged Vinny again, harder this time, his throat tight with something he didn't have a name for yet. Over the years, Brian continued working at Little Sicily's. The bond between the two of them only grew stronger. Vinny wasn't his father, and neither of them ever pretended otherwise, but he was something just as important, a constant, a witness, someone who saw Brian not as a project or a problem, but as a person becoming himself. So when Brian returned to the pizzeria nearly 30 minutes late from his last delivery that night, it didn't take a sixth sense for Vinny to know something was wrong. Brian moved quietly, eyes down, counting out his cash at the register. He didn't offer his usual commentary, didn't crack a joke, didn't ask about tomorrow's schedule. "Sorry I'm late," he muttered. Vinny was mopping near the back wall. He paused, watching Brian for a moment longer than usual. Then he leaned the mop against the wall and walked over, placing a heavy arm around Brian's shoulders. "Is everything okay?" When Vinny asked if everything was okay, Brian reacted faster than he meant to. "I'm fine," he said, a little too quickly. Vinny didn't move his arm from Brian's shoulder, but he shifted his weight, studying him. "You sure?" Brian kept counting the register drawer, stacking bills with more force than necessary. "Yeah, just got a lot on my mind." Vinny's brow tightened slightly. "Doesn't have anything to do with your last delivery, right? To some lady named Jay, I believe? You're never back this late." Brian's jaw flexed. "No," he said, "just trying to figure some things out." It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole truth. Vinny held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded slowly. "Okay, Brian. You let me know if you need me for anything." Brian nodded back. The following day, Brian came into the shop at 2 p.m. He ran the pizzeria alone until 4, so Vinny could go to the bank. When Vinny returned, Brian entered the driver rotation as usual. Toward the end of the shift, around 8:30, Vinny called him back into the kitchen. "Brian," he said, wiping his hands on a towel, "hang back with me for the last hour. I need help in here." Brian didn't question it out loud. He never did. "Sure, Vinny." But privately, he didn't understand the rationale. It was a Monday night. There were only 2 orders in the queue and 3 people already working the line. He wasn't needed. Still, he stayed. He put food back in the refrigerator, wiped down stainless steel surfaces, refilled containers, swept the floor. He moved efficiently, quietly. After about 30 minutes, Vinny called to him again. "Brian," he said, his tone casual, "I know I've got you all over the place today, but I need you to do me a favor." Brian looked up immediately. "Sure, Vinny. Whatever you need." Vinny held up a ticket. "We just got in this last-minute order, and I need you to deliver it for me." Brian nodded automatically. "No problem." Vinny handed him the slip. 1 large cheese pizza. Delivery to Julia, 1735 Main Street, apartment 1501. Brian stared at the paper. The air felt thinner. "Is she really placing another order after everything we discussed?" he muttered under his breath. He walked back toward Vinny, receipt still in hand. "Vinny," he said carefully, "can you do me a favor and let the new girl take this one? I'd like to get home a little earlier tonight." Vinny didn't hesitate. "No can do, kiddo. She's making runs for the last 2 deliveries of the night and won't have time." He tilted his head. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Brian replied, forcing his voice steady. "I was just looking to get home a little earlier. That's all." Vinny's eyes lingered on him. "This customer's been one of our best this week, Brian. I don't want to lose her. Make this 1 delivery and you're done for the evening. I'll clean everything up myself.
Don't you worry." There was no arguing with that. Brian nodded, though reluctantly, grabbed the pizza, and left. "Pizza delivery, Julia?" the doorman said into the intercom upstairs. "You can send him up," Julia replied. Within 1 minute, there was a knock at her door. Brian stood outside, jaw tight. When the door opened and Julia appeared, he didn't mask his frustration this time. "I thought I made it clear last night that this could not go on," he said, his voice elevated for the first time since she'd known him. "I am no longer at your employ, and hoped you'd understand that." Julia blinked, genuinely startled. "I did understand you, Brian," she said. "That's why I'm as confused as you are for being here." "You ordered a large cheese for delivery," Brian said. "What's there to be confused about?" "No, I didn't," Julia said. The simplicity of her answer disarmed him. Brian frowned. "It's your name, your address, your order." Julia stepped aside slightly, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I got home a little less than an hour ago," she began. "Long day, as usual. I'd barely taken my shoes off when my cell phone rang. It was Vinny." Brian's expression shifted. "He told me Little Sicily's is currently running a buy 5, get 1 free promotion, and that I qualified for a free pizza," she continued. "I tried telling him I've had more than my fair share of pizza in the last 3 days, but he was insistent that I accept this free gift. So I agreed." She met Brian's eyes. "I'm sorry that this situation has you frustrated again." Brian looked down at the receipt.
The name printed clearly said Julia. No pseudonym, no J, no trick. He replayed it in his head. Vinny must have called her directly, asked for her name, confirmed the address, printed the ticket properly. No scheme. At least, not by Julia. She opened her refrigerator door. "As you can see," she said lightly, "I don't have space for a 6th pizza anyway." Brian glanced inside. 4 boxes stacked unevenly, one half-eaten from earlier. She hadn't been exaggerating. A quiet beat passed between them. "If it's worth anything to you," Julia said softly, "it was nice to see you again, Brian. After last night's conversation, I was convinced I never would." Brian lifted his eyes from the receipt. The story now made perfect sense. Vinny wanted him here tonight. The question was no longer whether Julia had orchestrated this. The question was why Vinny had. Brian stood there, pizza box in hand, realization dawning slowly. Vinny had kept him in the kitchen when he wasn't needed. Vinny had insisted he take this delivery. Vinny had called Julia personally. This wasn't coincidence. This was intervention. Brian felt a mix of irritation and something else, something closer to reluctant gratitude. He looked at Julia again. "Would you like me to give this pizza to the doorman downstairs?" he said. "You clearly don't need it." "Yes, please," Julia said. "And thank you." For the first time since stepping off the elevator, his voice lost its edge. "I didn't know," he said simply. "I know," she replied. "I've got to get going. Take care, Julia." "You too," she said. Driving back to the pizzeria, the larger question pressed forward in Brian's head, impossible to ignore. What exactly was Vinny trying to do? Brian made it back to Little Sicily's in 18 minutes flat. He didn't remember half the turns he took getting there. The city blurred past him in streaks of red brake lights and storefront reflections. Why the elaborate scheme? The second time in as many days he'd been maneuvered into Julia's presence. Why not just talk to me directly? Why involve her at all? And what is it about Julia? He didn't even know her. The questions stacked on top of one another, urgent and unresolved. By the time he pulled up in front of the shop, he had already rehearsed 6 versions of the confrontation. Respectful, but firm. He wasn't a kid anymore. If Vinny had something to say, he could say it. Brian stepped out of the car and froze.
Vinny was sitting outside the pizzeria. Not inside behind the counter, not wiping down the ovens, not counting the till. Outside. He sat in a metal chair just to the right of the entrance, smoking a pipe Brian had only seen a handful of times over the years. His tomato sauce-stained apron still covered his Little Sicily t-shirt. The glow of the street lamp cast a soft halo around him. Beside him, placed deliberately close, was a second empty chair. Vinny looked up as Brian approached. "Take a seat, Brian," he said. There was no irritation in his voice, no defensiveness, just invitation. Brian exhaled slowly and complied, dragging the second chair closer before sitting down. The night air was cool, the street quieter than usual. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vinny removed the pipe from his mouth and asked, almost casually, "Have I ever told you about Francesca Altamonte?" Brian frowned slightly. "No." Vinny nodded, as if that confirmed something. "I grew up in Alcamo, Sicily," he began. "Small town, or at least it was then, about 25 miles west of Palermo." His accent thickened slightly when he said the names, as though memory pulled him backward. "When I was a teenager," he continued, "I fell in love with Francesca." He stared out at the empty street. She was beautiful. Not just in the way people say that. She had this light about her. And she knew I loved her. Deep down, I know she loved me too. Ryan listened without interruption. "I was a poor boy," Vinny said. "No father, just like you. My mother cleaned houses. We had enough to eat, but not much more." He tapped the side of the pipe against the chair's armrest. "Francesca came from a wealthy family. They owned several restaurants and the largest hotel in the village. Her father was important." Vinny's jaw tightened slightly. "One afternoon he saw the two of us talking after school. Nothing improper, just talking. He pulled me aside." Vinny's voice dropped to register. "He told me, formally, that I was to stop speaking with his daughter. Immediately." Brian felt his chest tighten. "He said there was nothing in this world I could offer her that she didn't already have," Vinny continued. "He told me it would be better for me to learn this sooner rather than later." He paused. His words broke me in a way that, even until this day, I have not fully recovered from. The streetlight flickered once, then steadied. "The following year," Vinny said quietly, "he arranged a marriage between Francesca and the oldest son of the largest cattle farmer in Palermo. Dairy products, cheese predominantly." A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "Within 1 week of learning of the engagement, I packed a bag and purchased a one-way ticket to the United States with the only money I had in the world." Ryan turned toward him fully now. "I ran away," Vinny said, "from the only country I had ever lived in, from the only woman I had ever loved." He took a slow breath. "Because I allowed other people to dictate to me what and who I was good enough for." Silence settled between them again, heavier this time. "Not a day has gone by in all the years since," Vinny continued, "that I haven't thought of Francesca. I am left with the thoughts of what could have been." He looked at Brian now, directly. "If that isn't the definition of lifelong regret, I don't know what is." He paused again, longer this time. The city hummed faintly in the distance. Then Vinny leaned forward slightly. "I sent you to Julia's tonight because I could see you were distraught," he said. Brian's brow furrowed. "In the only way that a man can truly feel out of place in this world." "And what's that?" Brian asked. Vinny didn't hesitate. "In the way by which a man loves a woman," he said softly, "and fears, and ultimately concedes, that she will never love him back." The words landed gently but decisively. Brian opened his mouth to object. "I don't," he began, then stopped, because whatever he had been about to say felt dishonest. All the questions he'd rushed back with, the accusations, the frustration, suddenly felt smaller. Not irrelevant, exactly, but reframed. Why the elaborate scheme? Because Vinny didn't want him running. Why not talk to me directly? Because some things a man has to see for himself. What is it about Julia? Ryan swallowed. He thought of the first time he'd seen her photo by the elevator, the nerves he couldn't explain, the fear of not being enough, the way her words had stung, not just because they were dismissive, but because they confirmed something he already suspected about himself. Perhaps Vinny had already answered every question without him having to ask. Brian stood up slowly. For a moment, Vinny thought he might argue, push back, dismiss the whole thing. Instead, Brian stepped forward and wrapped his arms around him. It wasn't the quick, grateful hug of an 18-year-old receiving a surprise gift. It was tighter, grounded, acknowledging something shared. Vinny patted his back once, twice. When they pulled apart, neither man felt the need to add anything else. Brian picked up both chairs and carried them back inside the restaurant. Vinny followed, stubbing out his pipe near the doorway. They locked up together in silence. At the door, Vinny clapped Brian lightly on the shoulder. "Good night, kiddo." "Good night, Vinny." They walked in opposite directions down the sidewalk. Brian didn't feel resolved, but he no longer felt confused. And for the first time since he'd seen Julia's name printed on that delivery slip days ago, he wasn't thinking about what he wasn't good enough for. He was thinking about what he might regret if he never found out.
Brian woke up the following morning, and the first thing that came to mind was her. Vinny's story from the night before lingered in his head like a song stuck on repeat. When Vinny had spoken, more honestly than Brian had ever heard him speak, about regret, about waiting too long, about losing a real shot at love. He opened his eyes fully and stared at the ceiling. Not tomorrow, he thought. Not next week. Now. The urgency surprised him. He wasn't impulsive by nature. He weighed things, turned them over, often until they lost their shine. But this felt different. It felt like a small window was open and might slam shut at any second. I'll see her today, he decided. But how? He rolled onto his side and grabbed his phone, then set it back down. No, not a text. He didn't even have her number. The realization stung. He sat up on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, and began working through possibilities. I could have Vinny arrange another delivery, he thought. He could probably schedule another delivery. No, that would cause nothing but unnecessary conflict between the two of us, and it would be obvious, transparent, a stunt. I can send her flowers. He pictured it, a bouquet delivered to a law office, her colleagues glancing over, smirking, whispering. It felt theatrical, forced. No, too taboo. She'll see right through it and likely consider it lame. He stood and began pacing his studio apartment. I've got one option, the only option that makes sense, the only option with a shot at making a difference. I'll go and speak directly to her, where we first met, at the office. The simplicity of it steadied him. It would be honest, no props, no schemes, just him. Brian showered longer than usual, letting the hot water drum against his shoulders as if it could wash away the nervous energy buzzing through him. He rehearsed lines in his head. He turned the water off abruptly. He couldn't script it too tightly. Real things didn't work that way. His wardrobe consisted entirely of jeans and t-shirts. He had never been one for variety or had the means to do so. But that didn't mean he couldn't put on his best ones. From the medicine cabinet, buried behind a half-used tube of toothpaste and an old razor, he retrieved a small glass bottle of cologne. $10 from a department store clearance rack. He uncapped it and hesitated. I haven't used this since Christmas last year when I went to see Mum, he muttered to himself. He dabbed a little on his wrists, then one cautious touch at the base of his neck. The scent was sharp at first, then mellowed into something almost respectable. He looked at himself in the mirror, not polished, not sophisticated, but sincere. That would have to be enough. The drive to Julie's office felt both too short and impossibly long. Every red light stretched time thin. His mind ricocheted between confidence and doubt. What if she's busy? What if she doesn't want to see me? The office building rose into view, a clean glass and steel structure that reflected the pale morning sky. He pulled into the parking lot and instinctively headed towards the employee section. It was farther from the entrance, requiring a longer walk, but it spared him the $1.50 an hour fee associated with the closer visitor parking. Inside, the lobby was just as he remembered. Polished tile floors, muted lighting, a faint hum of conversation echoing off high ceilings. The front desk was staffed by a young woman he didn't recognize. He approached, hands tucked awkwardly into his pockets. "Hi," he said. "I was hoping to see Sarah, the lobby manager." The receptionist looked up at him with professional politeness. "May I ask your name?" "Please tell her it's Brian," he replied. "She'll know who I am." Sarah came out of her office promptly to greet Brian. Although Brian had resigned after being on the job as a driver for her after just one day on it nearly 2 weeks ago, he did not leave on bad terms. Details of the resignation were not discussed, but a mutual understanding had formed between the two of them as to the likely reason why. "Brian," she said, smiling politely. "How are you, and what brings you here?" "Hello, Sarah. It's good to see you too," Brian replied. There was a slight pause. He had rehearsed his words all morning long. Now that the moment to speak had arrived, there was silence. "I'm not here to ask for my job back," he blurted out, his tone unintentionally defensive. Sarah read him immediately. There was a second, extended pause. Brian stared at the floor, hands fidgeting at his sides. If he didn't want his job back, what could it be? Sarah followed his gaze, then let her eyes lift slowly, thoughtfully. It took no more than a moment. "Oh, that's why he's here." "Why don't you take a seat in the lobby?" she said gently. "I'll be with you shortly."
Brian looked up, relief and anxiety mixing in his expression. He nodded. "Okay, thank you." Sarah returned to her office and closed the door behind her. She sat at her desk and picked up the phone, dialing a direct number to the law office occupying the 5th floor. It took one ring for Julia's assistant to answer. "Law offices of Harper & Klein. How may I help you?" "May I speak with Julia, please?" Sarah asked politely. "And whom do I have the pleasure of speaking with?" the assistant replied. "It's Sarah, the lobby manager downstairs." "One moment, please." A soft click, a brief silence, then another voice came onto the line. "Julie speaking." "Good morning, Julie," Sarah began. "I'm sorry to bother you in the middle of your workday, but I believe there's someone in the lobby who wants to speak with you." There was a subtle shift in Julie's tone. "May I ask whom?" "Brian," Sarah said. "I'll be right down," Julie replied, and hung up the phone. Julia stepped out of the elevator with the quiet composure of someone accustomed to moving through professional spaces with purpose. The doors slid closed behind her with a muted whisper, and the familiar expanse of the lobby stretched out ahead, polished tile floors reflecting the overhead lights, the front desk standing like a command post at the center of it all. Before she even reached the desk, her eyes met Sarah's. There was no verbal exchange. None was necessary. Sarah, ever perceptive, held Julia's gaze for half a second, then subtly shifted her eyes to the right. Julia followed the cue.
There he was. Brian sat exactly where Sarah had asked him to, one of the grey upholstered chairs along the wall, slightly removed from the main flow of foot traffic. His elbows rested loosely on his knees, his hands hung between them. His eyes were cast straight down at the tile floor, fixed not on any particular detail, but on the faint reflection staring back at him. He looked as though he were studying nothing at all. From a distance, he appeared calm, but Julia could see it. The tension in his shoulders, the stillness that wasn't peace but concentration, the posture of someone bracing himself. She felt something shift inside her. Without hesitating, she walked toward him. Brian did not notice her approach until she was well within his personal space. She closed the distance deliberately, disrupting the silent bubble he had constructed around himself. Yet another pleasant surprise, Brian? Her voice was soft, not sarcastic, not guarded. It carried warmth, an almost careful gentleness. When delivered as properly as Julia had just done, it had the power to dissolve defenses. It made its recipient feel welcomed, perhaps even wanted. Brian's gaze snapped upward. For a fraction of a second, confusion flickered across his face, like someone abruptly waking from a daydream. Then recognition flooded in. He stood immediately, too quickly perhaps. He rose with such suddenness that he nearly stepped into her. He caught himself at the last possible moment, adjusting his footing so as not to collide with her. The closeness between them made that outcome entirely possible. "Hi, Julie," he said. Standing had done nothing to improve his ability to speak. The same problem that had seized him with Sarah at the front desk returned in full force. Words existed in his mind. He could feel them there, but they refused to organize themselves into something coherent. He was taking a crash course in expressing his feelings, and he was flying blind. Julia sensed it immediately, the disorientation, the mental scrambling. She had spent years in courtrooms, reading witnesses, opposing counsel, juries. She knew what uncertainty looked like. She also knew when someone was trying. "Would you like to talk, Brian?" she asked gently. "Yes," he replied almost instantly, relief embedded in the single syllable. "I'd like to speak with you, if you have a moment." There was an earnestness in his voice that stripped the interaction of any pretense. Julia nodded. "Prior to coming downstairs, I was in the process of prepping one last file before calling it a day," she explained. "Completing this task will take approximately 15 minutes. Is that okay, Brian?" The politeness of the question struck him. He was the one who had interrupted her day, yet she asked for his permission, as though the arrangement needed mutual consent. "Of course, Julia," he said quickly. "Take as much time as you need." She studied him for a second longer, then added, "We should probably find another place to chat, a place with a lot less noise and a bit more privacy than the office lounge. Wouldn't you agree?" "Yes," he said. Then, with a small spark of confidence returning, "I know just the place." Across the lobby, Sarah remained on standby. She positioned herself far enough away to miss the parts of the conversation that she had no business hearing, but close enough to observe the direction in which things were moving. She understood that moments like these sometimes required a subtle nudge. As Julia began to turn toward the elevators, Sarah stepped forward just enough to deliver the final line in her supporting role. "Julia," she called out politely, "would you like me to have the car service come around front for you?" It was a simple question, one of routine. As a high-profile attorney in the building, Julia had access to certain perks, an all-inclusive package that afforded car service at a moment's notice. It was efficient, professional, expected. Julia didn't hesitate. "No, thank you," she said. Then, glancing toward Brian, she added, "I'm leaving with Brian, and he's going to take us wherever we need to go. Thanks, though." The words landed with quiet clarity. Sarah nodded once, satisfied. Julia disappeared back into the elevator and upstairs to close out her final file, leaving Brian in the lobby once more. But this time, he was not staring at the floor in uncertainty. He was processing. She declined the car service. The thought replayed in his mind. The car service. Sleek, black vehicles idling curbside, professional drivers in pressed uniforms, a convenience he could never provide. Instead, she had chosen his vehicle, his 15-year-old Toyota Tacoma on the verge of hitting 200,000 miles. The paint had dulled in places. The passenger door required a firm pull to close completely. The radio occasionally cut out when the volume was turned too high. And she chose that. In that moment, Julia did not care about the perks, the optics, or the lifestyle she was afforded. None of that factored into her decision. The only thing that mattered was the opportunity to talk to Brian, regardless of conditions. He looked up instinctively, hoping to see Sarah. He didn't have to search. She stood behind the front desk, already looking at him, as if she had been waiting for him to lift his head. Their eyes met. Sarah smiled. It was not the polite smile she offered tenants and visitors throughout the day. It was something warmer, more personal. Then she turned and walked back into her office. That smile said everything. It said, "You're welcome." A few minutes later, the elevator chimed again. Julia stepped out, briefcase in hand, movements efficient yet unhurried. "I'm ready when you are, Bran," she said. "Where would you like to go?" "No pizza tonight," he began with a faint grin. "I know of a great deli near my house that has an excellent variety of soups and salads that I believe you would enjoy." He paused. Then, choosing courage over comfort, he added, "Would you be opposed to having dinner with me this evening, Julia?" She tilted her head slightly, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Why do you think I'm down here, silly?" she replied in a playful tone. The word silly disarmed him completely. He laughed. "Excellent," he said. "We'll take it to go." The bell above the deli door chimed softly as Brian held it open for Julia. Warm air, fragrant with baked bread and simmering soups, wrapped around them as they stepped inside. The place was modest but inviting. Handwritten chalkboard menus, glass display cases stretching the length of the counter, and a steady hum of low conversation from scattered tables. They moved side by side toward the long refrigerated case where salads were displayed in neat rows. Over a dozen options lined the shelves, each labeled carefully, each layered with color and texture. Brian hadn't exaggerated. There was variety here, and quality too. Julia leaned slightly closer to the glass, scanning each option with quiet concentration. Her eyes moved methodically, the same way they might review evidence before trial, observant, selective, precise. She paused at one in particular. Cranberry raisin salad, sliced apples, fresh spinach, grilled chicken, a small packet of balsamic vinaigrette resting neatly against the container. "That one," she said, more to herself than to Brian. He nodded approvingly. Solid choice. His own tastes were simpler, predictable even. He selected a standard Caesar salad, grilled chicken on the side, no dressing. Clean. Straightforward. 2 Diet Cokes and 1 share-size bag of potato chips completed their meal. At the register, Brian pulled cash from his wallet, folded bills he had organized earlier that afternoon. He paid without hesitation, declining the receipt. It was a small gesture, but intentional. This evening mattered to him. They stepped back out into the cooling air, paper bags rustling softly in Brian's hands. "Where to next?" Julia asked. "My place," Ryan responded. There was a pause, not an awkward one, no discomfort, no misinterpretation, but a pause nonetheless. A space where implications existed quietly between them. Sensing the gap, Brian added gently, "You need not worry, Julia." "I'm not," she replied evenly.
The exchange settled whatever unspoken concern might have surfaced. Trust had entered the evening, not dramatically, but firmly. They drove in companionable silence through streets that gradually shifted in character. The storefronts became older, the sidewalks narrower, streetlights cast longer shadows. Ryan turned down a side street and parked behind an old brownstone apartment building. 3 stories tall, faded brick, windows that had weathered decades of seasons. It sat in what most would politely describe as the economically challenged part of town. "This is me," Brian said, lightly. They exited the truck and walked toward the back stairwell. The steps creaked under their weight as they climbed. At the top floor, Brian unlocked a narrow door and gestured for Julia to enter first. The studio apartment was exactly what its size suggested. A queen-size bed, neatly made with hospital corner precision, occupied one wall. A small desk and chair sat near the window. A single night lamp rested on a wooden crate, doubling as a bedside table. A 32-inch television perched atop a narrow nightstand, beside a PlayStation and a modest stack of games. Against another wall sat a mini-fridge. Inside were 6 bottles of water and a half-eaten tuna fish sandwich that looked as though it had survived at least a month too long. The bathroom, visible through a partially open door, contained a tight stand-up shower, toilet, and small vanity with mirror. Julia took it all in quietly. There was no judgment in her eyes, only assessment. She shifted the paper bag slightly in her hands. "Where in your apartment do you intend for us to eat our food, Brian?" she asked, intuitively. He met her gaze with a small smile. "We're not." She raised an eyebrow. On the wall opposite the entrance stood another door, nondescript, easy to overlook. "Just a few more steps," Brian said. He opened it to reveal a narrow stairwell leading upward. The climb was steeper than the one below, the space tighter. At the top was a simple hatch that opened onto the roof. Brian climbed first and offered his hand to help her through. When Julia stepped onto the rooftop, she paused again, this time not out of caution, but curiosity. The roof stretched modestly around them, edged by a low brick barrier. The skyline of the city glowed in the distance, lights flickering against the deepening blue of early night. A small table sat near the center, its surface weathered but sturdy. 2 wooden stools rested beneath it. A hammock hung securely between 2 reinforced posts. A few empty water bottles lay near one corner. On another small side table sat a couple of books, sealed carefully inside large Ziploc bags to protect them from the elements. The scene was simple, but deliberate. Brian walked ahead and began wiping down the table with a cloth he had tucked into his back pocket. Julia felt something soften inside her. This was not accidental. This was prepared. They sat down and opened their meals. For several minutes they spoke very little. Forks dipped into salad containers, the crinkle of chip bags punctuated the quiet. Every so often, one of them would glance up, meeting the other's eyes briefly before returning to their food. The silence wasn't empty. It was comfortable, measured. 2 people acclimating to one another's presence without rushing to fill space. Brian, unsurprisingly, finished first. His movements were efficient, deliberate but unhurried. Julia, more meticulous in her eating, continued savoring each bite. This extra time, unbeknownst to her, allowed Brian to prepare the next part of the evening. He rose quietly. "Sit tight," he said, placing his hand gently on her left arm. "I'll need a moment." She nodded, lifting her Diet Coke to her lips. At the far edge of the roof stood an old brick chimney, long unused. Near its base was a small metal hatch, once likely used for storing wood or coal, perhaps both. A padlock secured it. Ryan walked over and unlocked it. Inside rested a large black bag. Julia watched with open curiosity as he carried it back toward the table. He first removed a tripod and assembled it carefully, adjusting each leg for balance. Then he withdrew a telescope, not new, not sleek like those featured on science documentaries, but sturdy and functional. He attached it with steady hands. Julia finished her last forkful just as he made the final adjustment. "I believe it's ready now," Brian said softly. "Please, take a look." She stood and approached. The sky had darkened fully now, stars beginning to assert themselves against the backdrop of night. Julia leaned forward and looked through the telescope. Her breath caught. The sky expanded before her, distant lights sharpened into focus. Objects invisible to the naked eye revealed themselves in quiet brilliance. She had never done this before. Julia was a trial lawyer, a formidable one. Her world revolved around statutes, precedent, persuasion. Stargazing offered no strategic advantage in a courtroom. It had never demanded her attention. But now she stood silently, gazing upward for nearly 10 minutes. Brian stood beside her, not intruding, not explaining prematurely, just present, ready to adjust the lens if needed, answer any questions she might have. "Brian," she asked finally, still looking through the scope, "what are these two larger, brighter stars that are close together?" He smiled slightly. "Last year," he began, "I read a relationship book that forever altered my perception of how I view both men and women." Julia didn't move. She continued observing. The book explores the interpersonal dynamics between men and women, how they communicate differently, what their emotional needs are, how they cope. The author argues that men and women are fundamentally different, but if they're willing to put in the work and remain committed, they can coexist in a functional relationship. They can be happy together. Julia slowly lifted her head and looked at him. Her expression carried curiosity and mild confusion. She had asked about stars. He was discussing relationships. Brian noticed. He waited patiently until she returned her gaze to the telescope. "Those two larger, brighter spheres you're looking at," he continued gently, "are not stars. They're planets." A pause. "The book I mentioned, by John Gray, is called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus." She remained silent. "At this moment in time," he said, "you're looking at the western sky at an event that happens once every 2 to 3 years. You're looking at both Mars and Venus, in alignment." Julia stayed still for nearly 20 seconds. Mars and Venus. Planets, not stars. Different bodies, different orbits, occasionally aligned. When she finally lifted her head again, her expression had changed. The confusion was gone. In its place was understanding. Brian had just done something remarkable. Not through grandiosity or wealth or status. He had connected astronomy and human behavior in a way that felt effortless. He had told a story. He had taken something vast and abstract and made it intimate. Julia had always been complex, sophisticated, exceptionally intelligent. It took extraordinary effort to impress her. Brian, a delivery driver with a 20-year-old telescope, had just done so with a minute-long dialogue and a clear night sky. She turned toward him fully now. The city lights flickered behind them. The telescope stood quietly between them like a witness. For the first time that evening, she stepped closer. Not by accident, not by proximity of space, but by intention. "Can I kiss you, Brian?" Brian did not hesitate. He looked directly into her eyes, just as he always had. That had been one of the first things Julia noticed about him weeks ago. He did not dart his gaze away when she spoke. He did not shrink under her intensity. He met her there, steady, present. Now, standing on the rooftop of a worn brownstone in the overlooked part of the city, he leaned forward and complied with her request. This wasn't a peck. It wasn't a cautious test of boundaries. It wasn't the kind of kiss people exchange to confirm mutual interest before retreating into safety. It was decisive. It was grounded. It was the kind of kiss Julia had only ever heard described through her headphones at 6 a.m., walking on a treadmill before sunrise. She had a long list of audiobooks to choose from, self-development, legal strategy, and occasionally, when no one was around to hear, modern romance novels. Those stories always described masculine men, chivalrous to their cause, steady under pressure, capable of breaking through a woman's armor and capturing her soul with clarity and intent. She used to listen with mild skepticism. Real life wasn't like that, or so she thought. Brian just did that. It took one kiss. There was no rush in him, no frantic hunger. His hands found her waist with confidence, but not possession. His presence was calm, commanding without force. He did not overwhelm her. He grounded her. And in that grounding, something in Julia softened. She had built her life on structure, preparation, precision. Courtrooms were arenas where she wielded language like a weapon. She projected power because power was necessary. Her voice did not tremble. Her posture did not waver. Her arguments did not bend. Armor, carefully crafted over years. Brian broke through it, not by attacking it, but by standing firm in front of it. In that moment, he satisfied the first tenet of attraction, physical desire. When Julia first saw him, she had noticed he was attractive. Of course she had. She was observant by nature, but she had not been salivating at the mouth. She had not been overtaken by impulse. When he held the door open for her the first time she stepped into his vehicle, her mind had been elsewhere, on a case that required precision, on a witness whose testimony could tilt the scales of justice, on the projection of authority she needed to maintain. That did not mean she hadn't noticed him. Broad shoulders, steady posture, quiet eyes. Attraction had been present, it simply had not yet been ignited. Now it was. The second tenet had formed more subtly: trust and safety. Julia replayed it in her mind, even as the kiss deepened. That afternoon with her star witness, the conversation that did not go to plan, the frustration she carried when she stepped back into the car. She had not intended to show it, but he saw it anyway. He didn't sit in silence. He didn't withdraw. He engaged her. Light conversation, a slice of pizza offered casually, almost playfully. He had used the only tools he possessed, kindness, humor, presence, to shift her emotional state. A woman he had just met. He had not been indifferent. That mattered. It took the following day, riding with a different driver, for her to recognize the contrast. The silence, the detachment, the absence of attunement. She didn't just want someone to listen. She needed someone who would notice, someone who would care when her voice carried strain, someone who would lean in instead of pulling back. Trust and safety were not built through grand gestures. They were built in moments when vulnerability surfaced and was met with steadiness. Brian had done that instinctively. The third tenet was competence. On paper, they were not evenly matched. Julia's education dwarfed his. Her income could fund luxuries Brian never considered. She operated in high-profile legal circles. He calculated gas usage carefully, keeping his tank just past half full to ensure he could complete his workday without strain. But competence is not measured only in degrees or dollars. Brian demonstrated competence by enlightening her. He taught her something she did not know. Not in a condescending way, not to impress, but through story. He connected astronomy and human psychology in 60 seconds and left her thinking differently about both. If he could do that once, he could do it again. She could look to him for thought-provoking conversation, for insight, for humor at the right moment.
And he delivered it in a way that made her feel good. That final detail mattered more than any resume line. He made her feel good. Not flattered, not manipulated. Good. Safe. Curious. Feminine. The importance of that cannot be overstated. Attraction, trust and safety. Competence. With those three tenets now satisfied, Brian did not have to search for an opportunity to make physical contact. It was requested. The kiss deepened naturally, unforced. When they finally separated, the city hummed softly below them. The air had grown cooler, the warmth of the evening replaced by a subtle chill creeping across the rooftop. Brian, now exuding a level of confidence entirely absent in the office lobby hours earlier, smiled slightly. "It's getting a little chilly out," he said. "Would you like to go inside?" This time, permission rested with her. "Yes," she replied. "It is a little chilly outside, and I would like to go inside." They descended the narrow stairwell, the rooftop hatch closing softly above them. Inside the studio, the small lamp cast a golden glow against the walls. What followed was not rushed. Time loosened its grip. Brian stepped fully into his masculine presence, decisive yet attentive. He did not hesitate. He did not ask for constant reassurance. He led, but with awareness. Julia, in turn, relaxed into her feminine energy in a way she had never allowed herself to. The courtroom required sharpness. This space allowed softness. Hours dissolved. Any frame of reference for time slipped quietly away. There were no clocks consulted, no phones checked. There was only presence. When morning finally approached, they were not surprised. The night had carried them forward without interruption. Eventually, reality returned in gentle reminders. Julia had work in a few hours. Trial preparation waited. Starbucks would need to double her order. They dressed in comfortable silence, an unspoken understanding flowing between them. When they stepped outside and approached Brian's Tacoma, the sky was shifting from indigo to pale gold. He drove her back through streets just beginning to stir with early commuters. He pulled to a stop in front of Julia's apartment building. "When will I see you again?" he asked. It was his biggest gamble of the evening, though technically it was morning now. Julia unbuckled her seatbelt slowly. Instead of answering immediately, she leaned over and kissed him again. Not as intensely as before, but deliberately. "You can see me whenever you want, Brian," she said softly. He searched her eyes. "You know I have the trial next week," she continued. "That's going to require laser focus. But from this moment forward, regardless of circumstance, I'll make myself available to you. No questions asked." There was a pause. Not awkward. Entangled. Their eyes locked once more in silent recognition of what had shifted between them. Brian broke it gently. "If you don't get going, you're going to be late for work," he said with a faint grin. "Enjoy the rest of your day, love." The word landed differently. Not Julia. Not a nickname borrowed from habit. Love. She stepped out of the truck slowly, closing the door behind her. For the first time, he hadn't referred to her directly by name. The elevator doors slid shut, and she watched her reflection in the mirrored walls. She touched her lips absent-mindedly. The realization unfolded gradually, but unmistakably. For the first time in her adult life, she understood precisely what was happening to her. She was falling in love. The week of the trial unfolded exactly as Julia had planned it. There were no surprises, no dramatic courtroom reversals, no last-minute evidence materializing out of nowhere. Julia had prepared for nearly a year. She knew the case file as if she had written it herself. Every witness statement, every piece of forensic data, every potential objection the defense might raise, she had catalogued, rehearsed, and neutralized them long before stepping into the courtroom. When the defense attempted a procedural curveball on the second day, she batted it back with surgical precision. When they tried to undermine her witnesses' credibility, she dismantled the attempt with documented evidence and controlled cross-examination. She did not raise her voice. She did not posture unnecessarily. She simply executed. Julia, in her element, was a force, and when she was that force, there wasn't anything that could stop her. On the final day of the trial, Her key witness performed exactly as expected, resourceful with their words, deliberate in their pacing, telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Every claim was backed by documentation, every statement aligned with established facts. The courtroom felt less like a battleground and more like the final chapter of a book whose ending had already been written. When the jury exited to deliberate, there was no visible anxiety on Julia's face. She organized her papers calmly, exchanged a few quiet words with her team, and waited. It took the jury less than 2 hours. When everyone gathered back into the courtroom, the atmosphere lacked suspense. Even the defendant seemed resigned. The jury finds the defendant guilty on all charges. The words were read into the court record plainly, but they carried weight. Justice had prevailed. Julia nodded once, measured, professional. No dramatic exhale, no visible celebration. She shook hands with colleagues, thanked her team, acknowledged the judge. It took nearly an hour to complete the ritual of congratulations and gratitude. She exited the courtroom and descended the courthouse steps where cameras were already gathering. Microphones extended toward her. "How do you feel about the verdict? Do you believe this sets precedent? Any statement for the victims?" She delivered what she always did, controlled, articulate sound bites. "We're glad to see justice having prevailed," she said, voice steady. "This verdict reflects the integrity of the judicial process." She was accustomed to the cameras. The spotlight did not intimidate her. The superficial elements of recognition were not new. What was new was what stood beyond the flashing lights. On the far end of the street, well behind the media cluster, leaned a familiar figure against a 15-year-old Toyota Tacoma. Brian, hands in pockets, watching her from a distance, not competing with the cameras, not seeking attention. Just there. When the media dispersed and the courthouse steps cleared, Julia gathered her briefcase and walked directly toward him. Before she could say a word, he spoke first. "By the smug look on your face and the grand lights of the paparazzi I just witnessed, it does appear that you have won your case," he said with mock seriousness. "Now I must ask myself, am I ever going to hear the end of this?" His tone was sarcastic, thoughtful. Julia adjusted the strap of her briefcase. "Grounded as you are, sir," she replied evenly. "Given all of your limitations, you have assumed correctly, both on the result of the trial and its aftermath. You are unlikely to ever hear the end of this." He laughed. He took her briefcase from her hand without asking, pulled her into a firm embrace, and kissed her in full daylight. No cameras now, no spectacle. "Sushi to celebrate?" he asked. "Of course," she replied. They climbed into the Tacoma and drove away from the courthouse. At the restaurant, Julia ordered expansively. Specialty rolls, sashimi, spicy tuna. Brian, as usual, kept his choices simple. California rolls, maki. "Why only California rolls and maki?" Julia asked again, for what felt like the 1,000th time. "I have simple tastes, Julia," Brian declared. "The quality of the restaurant is not going to change that." She narrowed her eyes in theatrical annoyance. "You are impossible." Her frustration carried no real weight. A smile broke through almost instantly. Brian noticed, as he always did, and shifted the conversation. "So what's next, Julia?" She paused mid-bite. "You know, I haven't thought about it," she admitted. "This trial has consumed me for the better part of a year. Its result and conclusion are satisfactory, of course." She glanced at him. "I have you now, and I couldn't be happier with you being a major part of my life. I guess I haven't really put much thought into it, about what happens next." Brian studied her face carefully as she spoke. He saw beneath the surface, certainty in some areas, ambiguity in others. Are you sure about that, Julia? He asked quietly. Sure about what? Are you sure you couldn't be happier? He let the question sit. Julia slowly put down her chopsticks. She stared at him. What is he asking me? Her mind began scanning possibilities. I don't want another man, she joked lightly. You're enough of a headache for me. There's no other man in this world that can handle you, Julia, he replied with both humor and confidence. We're stuck with each other, and we both know it. She rolled her eyes, but her smile lingered. Well, there really isn't room for me to grow within my firm, she said thoughtfully. I've sort of plateaued professionally. I'm not talking about your career, Brian said. That stopped her. She picked up her spicy tuna roll again, but didn't eat it. No other man. No further career prospects. What is he proposing that could possibly make me happier? Wait, is he asking? She froze. The restaurant noise faded into background hum. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Brian, are you asking me if I want to start a family with you? He didn't flinch. Do you? He asked directly. The simplicity of his response stunned her. There was no elaborate speech, no preamble, just the question returned to her. Julia leaned back slowly, mind racing. Risk, time, identity, control. Before she could answer, Brian smirked. Let me guess, you never really thought about it. She exhaled. Yeah, I guess I hadn't. The drive back to her apartment was quieter than usual. Not tense, but reflective. Brian had opened a door, not forcefully, but unmistakably. A door that led somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere that complicated an already complex life. Inside her apartment later that evening, they lay in her bed, city lights glowing faintly through the curtains. Julia stared at the ceiling. Brian lay beside her, one arm resting behind his head. Suddenly, she grabbed a pillow and smacked him squarely in the face. What did you do that for? He blurted out, half laughing. You always do this to me, she said. Do what? Force me into thinking deeply about things I had no intention of considering. You force me into unplanned detours. I hate you for it. She paused, studying his expression. I also love you for it. She leaned forward and kissed him softly before resting her head on his chest. Brian wrapped his arm around her. He didn't apologize. He didn't retract the question. He simply held her. Let's get some sleep, he said. But Julia didn't fall asleep right away. Her mind wandered through scenarios she had never allowed herself to entertain. Motherhood, shared responsibility, a life not entirely structured around court dates and verdicts. For years, she had measured growth by promotions, case wins, media recognition. Now another metric hovered quietly in her thoughts. Fulfillment beyond achievement. Brian had a way of doing this, of asking questions that appeared simple but detonated gently beneath the surface. He didn't demand answers, he just planted seeds. As she lay against him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, she recognized something important. For the first time, the idea of slowing down did not feel like losing momentum. It felt like expanding it, not replacing ambition, redefining it. She tightened her arm around him slightly. He had asked her if she could be happier. The honest answer, she realized, was yes. Not because something was missing, but because something new could be added. And in the quiet space between accomplishment and possibility, Julia allowed herself to imagine a future she had never formally planned, but suddenly could see clearly. Brian did not need to push further. The question had done its work, and for a woman who had built her life on certainty, the willingness to consider uncertainty might have been the most transformative verdict of all. 5 years later. You did this to me, Julia screamed. Her voice echoed off the pale hospital walls as she gripped both sides of the bed she had been lying in for the past 2 hours. Her knuckles were white, her hair damp against her forehead, and her blare, if weaponized, could have leveled the entire maternity ward. Brian stood at the foot of the bed, just outside what he had privately labeled the launch radius. "Baby, it's going to be all over soon, I promise," he said calmly. He had prepared for this. Before Julia had even been wheeled into the room, he had quietly removed every object within arm's reach that could be thrown: water cups, remote controls, decorative pillows. This was not his first rodeo. "I swear I'm going to sue you, this doctor, this hospital, and any man walking the earth for bodily harm and reckless endangerment," she shouted. "Moving forward, any man who even thinks about delivering his seed into the womb of another woman will face my wrath, I promise." The doctor paused briefly, eyebrows raised. "Wait, is she serious?" he asked, momentarily distracted from the task at hand. Brian shook his head. "No, don't worry about it. She said the same thing 3 years ago when our son was born. Don't worry." The contractions subsided, and Julia inhaled sharply, recalibrating for the next wave. Slowly, the epidurals began to take effect. Julia's expression softened marginally. "Doc," she said, her voice now only moderately combative, "if these meds continue to have the desired effect, I may drop my claim against you personally. Just you, though." The doctor chuckled briefly. "I'll take that as progress," he replied. "Okay, Julia," he said, moments later, refocusing. "Time to push." She did. Again. She pushed again. The rhythm began. Push, breathe, recalibrate. Push, breathe, recalibrate. Brian moved closer now, out of the danger zone, holding her hand, whispering encouragement between clenched teeth as if willing his steadiness into her strength. 15 minutes of back-and-forth wrangling followed. The room was a choreography of instruction and effort. Then, a small but unmistakable shift. "I can see the head," the doctor announced. A lightness entered the room. "Just a little more, Julia. You're almost done." She gathered whatever remained of her resolve and pushed once more. Within a minute, the assisting nurse cleared the baby's nose and mouth. A sharp, decisive cry pierced the air. It was the most beautiful sound Brian had ever heard. "Congratulations to you both," the nurse said warmly, "on the birth of a healthy baby girl." Julia exhaled completely, as if releasing not just pain, but the accumulated weight of the past 9 months. Julia fell asleep shortly afterward. The exhaustion overtook her swiftly, completely. Within minutes, she was breathing deeply, her face finally peaceful. Brian, however, could not. He had been awake for nearly 24 hours straight, yet sleep felt impossible. He stood at the nursery window, forehead pressed gently against the glass, staring at his newborn daughter in constant vigil. Tiny fingers curled reflexively, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in delicate rhythm. 3 years earlier, when their son had been born, now he felt awe and something else. Responsibility had doubled. Love had multiplied. The following morning, after monitoring Julia's vitals and ensuring stability, the doctor gave the all-clear for discharge. Brian handled the paperwork efficiently, loaded the car seat carefully, and opened the passenger door for Julia, as he always did. On the drive home, he glanced at her. "Anything in particular you'd like to eat tonight?" he asked politely. "I'm still suing you, Brian," she replied dryly. "Stop trying to butter me up." He smirked. "You could take whatever you want," he said. "It's all in my wife's name anyway." Julia smiled faintly and turned her gaze toward the coastline passing by outside the window. "Sushi?" Brian asked carefully. She shook her head. "The sushi sucks around here, Brian. We both knew within a month of coming here that was going to be a small sacrifice I was going to have to make." He nodded. "Was it worth it?" She turned to him fully now. "You know it has, Dum-Dum." The nickname carried warmth. "Let's stop at the deli and pick up some fresh bread and cold cuts," she added. "It'll be nice to have some deli meat again. It's been a while." Pregnancy restrictions had limited her indulgences. Now, Liberation tasted like prosciutto. Brian pulled into the familiar deli parking lot. "Stay in the car with the kids," he said. "I'll be in and out." Inside, the bell chimed softly as he approached the counter. "May I please have £1 each of prosciutto, mortadella, capicola, and roast beef," he said. The deli clerk raised an eyebrow. "Looks like someone's having a party." Brian smiled. "No, those are all for my wife, except for the roast beef. That's for me." The clerk laughed. As the slicer hummed to life, Brian stepped away to survey the cheese section. It didn't matter where they moved, he thought privately. Julia's expensive tastes would never change, nor would his simpler ones. Working efficiently while the meats were being prepared, he scanned the refrigerated case. He needed 2 cheeses, £1 mozzarella, £1 provolone. But not just any mozzarella and provolone. They had to be the right brand. He had learned this the hard way. If he returned home with an inferior substitute, Julia would complain, possibly theatrically, perhaps even by throwing a shoe. He never understood how she could be so accurate with those things. He scanned the shelves once. Nothing. Twice. Then, there they are, he said aloud triumphantly. Freshly sliced mozzarella and provolone, packaged neatly in £1 portions. The label read, Francesca's. One day later. They woke the next morning in the same position they had fallen asleep in, Julia's head resting on Brian's chest, his right arm draped across her body, pulling her gently into him. There was something unspoken in the symmetry of it. Neither had shifted in the night. Neither had drifted far. It was as if their bodies, even in sleep, had decided that proximity was non-negotiable. When Brian stayed over at Julia's place, their routine was almost ritualistic, predictable, comfortable. An unconscious choreography that reflected something deeper than habit. They would shower together, typically no more than 20 minutes. Efficient, playful, occasionally competitive over water temperature. But there were mornings when Brian's physical enthusiasm in Julia's presence extended the timetable indefinitely. He would, of course, blame her. "I don't have this problem when you're not around," he would say. On those mornings, anything scheduled throughout the course of Julia's day needed to be restructured. Fortunately for Julia, and unfortunately for Brian, this was not one of those mornings. They stepped into the shower quietly, steam rising around them. There was less teasing than usual, more thoughtful silence. Brian washed her hair. Julia traced circles along his shoulder absent-mindedly. It felt intimate in a way that surpassed flirtation. It felt like partnership. Afterward, they dressed simply, shorts and t-shirts, the unofficial uniform of early domesticity, and made their way to the kitchen. Brian began breakfast without instruction, 3 egg omelettes, applewood bacon. He moved with an ease that came from repetition. Julia started the coffee machine and opened her laptop, scanning emails, occasionally narrowing her eyes at a subject line before closing the tab again. For once, the urgency of litigation did not command her full attention. They sat across from one another, plates warm between them, the smell of bacon filling the space. Halfway through her omelette, Julia set her fork down. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, Brian." He didn't look up immediately. He finished chewing, wiped his mouth deliberately, then met her gaze. "And what thoughts have popped in that head of yours as a result?" he replied. Julia smiled faintly. He always had a way of disarming her with tone alone. "I've been contemplating the logistics of it all," she said. "Logistics?" Brian asked, genuinely curious. "Yes. How would we go about this?" He paused, picked up a full strip of bacon, scoffed it down as if preparing for a debate. "Look, Julia," he began, leaning back slightly. "I'm fully prepared to have you quote H.K. Williams at me. Failing to plan is planning to fail. You may even allow yourself to believe you'll never practice law again, a fallacy that'll only be true if you choose it to be." Julia's eyes narrowed, but she didn't interrupt. "You'll come up with every excuse in the book to prolong, delay, or omit this path as a lifestyle option for both of us," he continued.
You'll treat it like a lawsuit that you're trying to win instead of simply playing the game as you're supposed to. And if you're successful in that endeavor, I'm okay with that. I've already won. I have you." The words were delivered without manipulation, no pressure, just fact. Julia felt the weight of it. "And I have you, Brian," she replied quietly. "I'm just a bit unsure about this next move." "I understand, Julia. Trust me, I do," he said. "Let's not forget I'm part of this equation too. I may not have to spend as much time as you contemplating career consequences, but if I'm going to be a good husband, a good father, it'll take a lifelong commitment and investment of everything I am." The kitchen grew still. Julia looked down at her half-eaten omelette, now cooling on the plate. She was accustomed to controlling outcomes, forecasting variables, anticipating risk. Courtrooms rewarded preparation. Life, she was learning, did not always operate under those same parameters. Ryan leaned forward again. "Every day, all around the world, people with no plan whatsoever fall in love, get married, and have children," he said. "The logistics, the resources, none of that matters as much as we think it does. I'm not saying be careless, but people shouldn't let logistics become an impediment to living their lives. The smart ones don't." Julia lifted her gaze. "I have about $400,000 saved in the bank," she said slowly. "Another $200,000 tucked away in a 401k. "Well, there you go," Brian replied immediately. "I could probably clear 2,000 to 3,000 selling the Tacoma," he added. "We can throw that in with the rest. Then again, I always had a feeling you were only dating me for my money anyway, so this comes as no surprise." Julia tried to maintain composure. She failed. Laughter erupted out of her, full, unrestrained, almost violent. She bent forward, one hand on the table, the other covering her mouth as if attempting to contain it. It lasted nearly a full minute, the kind of laughter that leaves you breathless. Brian watched her, amused but slightly confused. "I didn't think it was that funny," he said cautiously. She straightened slowly, and that's when he saw it. Tears. Not from laughter alone. Something deeper. He leaned forward instinctively. "Are you okay, Julia?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, eyes glassy but steady. "I love you, Brian," she said. The shift in tone was immediate, grounded, certain. "I love you more than I can put into words. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to have your children." The kitchen, moments ago filled with humor, now felt sacred. "I'm going to put in for 6 weeks unpaid time off tomorrow," she continued. "We'll take a vacation. We'll figure out the details, together. What do you think?" Brian did not hesitate. "Now that," he said, smiling, "more than anything, sounds like a plan." Julia said she wanted to go somewhere warm with nice beaches. Brian said he wanted to go somewhere historic, where he can learn something new. They both landed on Sicily as the top option. That first day being there on vacation with Julia, browsing a local grocery store, Brian asked a store clerk what cheese would go best with the bottle of red wine he was holding. The clerk said, with his Sicilian accent, "I couldn't tell you what cheese to have with your delicious red wine from Tuscany. All Italian wines are delicious. Tuscany, Napoli, Sicily, no matter. But you must make sure that whatever cheese you purchase, that the label reads Francesca's." Brian responded back politely. "Francesca's, you say?" "Yes, Francesca's. The company was started many years ago by a young couple. The young man's family had been in the cheese business in Palermo for generations, and as a tribute to his newlywed wife, he created a new line of cheeses under her name. Unfortunately for the two of them, divorce would soon follow. It was an arranged marriage that would ultimately end because they were never passionately in love with one another. You see, son, you must allow your heart to choose the person you're going to spend the rest of your life with. If not, you'll end up regretting it. Anyway, after the divorce, Francesca maintained ownership of the brand and personally upholds the quality and standards of the product. Francesca Altamonte, you know? With all her success, she still lives here in Alcoma to this day. Brian thanked the store clerk for his advice and selected a variety of cheeses from the refrigerated section, all of them branded Francesca's. He and Julia headed to the register to pay. Upon exiting the store, Brian asked Julia to give him 5 minutes to make a quick phone call. Julia, now curious, asked, "To whom are you calling?" Brian blurted out excitedly, "Vinny."
5 years later. After getting back to the house, both Julia and Brian agreed that prosciutto and roast beef sandwiches would have to wait a few minutes longer. Brian conjured up a grilled cheese sandwich and cut it into triangles. Julia prepped the milk. Having his 3-year-old son sit in his lap while eating the grilled cheese sandwich he just made, Brian spoke to him. "Look, Vincent, you're a big brother now. You now have a responsibility to look after your little sister. It's your job to protect her the way Daddy protects Mummy." Julia looked up at Brian. "I almost spilled some of Sarah's milk, poor thing." After putting both Vincent and Sarah to bed, they finally had a moment together. Julia prepped the cold cuts. Brian sliced the bread. "Francesca's," Julia spoke out loud. "You've done well for yourself this evening." Brian smiled. "How are they doing anyway, Vinny and Francesca?" "Did you like New York?" Julia asked. "When I spoke with him last week, Vinny had mixed feelings. He wanted to do something special for their 3rd anniversary, so he booked a hotel right off Park Avenue. He took her to the Museum of Natural History, the Met, top of the Empire State Building, Statue of Liberty, etc. He did the full tourist thing. Francesca seemed happy throughout the trip, he said, and she showed nothing but gratitude. But looking deeper, he could tell something was off. Rather, he could feel it. His words, not mine, Brian said. "What was it?" Julia asked. "What felt off to him?" Francesca was out of place. Everything that encompasses a big city, the buildings, the lights, the restaurants, the glamour, the traffic, the endless amounts of people. All of it seemed to overwhelm Francesca, he said, and she never truly felt comfortable. He believes that the happiest part of their trip was the return flight home. Brian paused for a moment, then continued. The evening they got back, he accompanied her to their dairy farm. While sitting on a bench looking out at the pasture, Francesca leaned into him and said, "Mi mancano le mie vacche." Brian attempted to say in his broken Sicilian. Julia, now having finished a delicious bite of the hand-carved prosciutto sitting on her kitchen counter, questioned immediately, "What does that mean?" Brian looked up at her, English translation. "I miss my cows." They both laughed simultaneously for a good minute. "Well, they're home now, and they finally have each other. That's all that really matters in this life, no?" Julia said, putting it in the form of a question without really seeking or needing an answer. Brian nodded in agreement. After finishing dinner, the two of them went out on their front porch for a nightcap. Julia with a glass of wine, Brian with his pipe, an ugly habit that he picked up over the last 2 years, thanks to Vinny. Julia, however, did not approve. "When are you going to stop smoking that thing? Next time you see Vinny, tell him I'm going to sue him for environmental hazards. We're in the EU now. I have a case," Julia said. Ryan smirked. "Do you have any regrets, Julia, with all of the decisions we've made?" Julia sat with that question for a second and responded, "I'll admit, 5 years ago I was a little apprehensive. Yes, we had an amazing 3-week vacation here in Alcoma. The people, the culture, the lifestyle. Neither of us wanted to leave. Quite the opposite experience that Francesca had in New York. But when we got back home and finally made the decision to move here, open the hotel on the beach and buy that used boat with you having no sailing experience, I knew what the end result would be." Brian focused in on her. "And what result is that?" Brian asked. "Happiness," Julia said. "The hotel provides far more than what we need for a comfortable living, and your weekend charter excursions are now a top tourist attraction on Yelp. Any hiccups along the way, I knew you would figure them out. And in the few times you needed help or support with any of the projects that our new lifestyle demands, I am there for you. I'm living the dream, Brian." Julia paused, then asked, "What about you? How do you feel?" Brian, taking another puff from his pipe and blowing it in the opposite direction of Julia, responded, "I've always known that you and I would end up together, and as I've said, that's all that mattered. As long as I have you, I've won. It did, however, take a little longer than that for me to receive confirmation about our path," Brian said. Julia, engaged and curious as ever, asked, "Confirmation about our path? Please explain." "Don't think for a second I wasn't aware of the sacrifices you were set to make by coming here. Very few people, both men and women, would walk away from being partner at a prestigious law firm and the career you were bound to have. I was unsettled, to say the least, about you giving all that up. Then, out of the blue, less than a month from us being here, Vinny calls me and tells me he's flying out here for a month and would like to stay in one of our rooms. I jokingly said that I didn't expect him to miss me that much so soon. After laughing at me, he said Francesca Altamonte no longer wishes to live the rest of her life with regret, and I feel obligated to accommodate her in this endeavor. Within 90 days of that conversation, Little Sicily's pizzeria had been sold, a single bag packed, and a one-way ticket purchased. This time here, to Alcoma. If Vinny can give up everything he'd built over the course of his lifetime to live the last chapter of his life with the woman he's always loved without regret, then I could embrace a path that would allow me an entire lifetime in doing so." Julia stood up, leaned in, and kissed Brian. "Let's go check on Sarah. And you need to get some sleep. 7 a.m. dolphin excursion tomorrow, and 2 new guests checking in at 11. Brian put out his pipe, nodded politely, and complied with Julia's requests, just like he had always done.